I am Harper Davis. I am 32 years old and a senior independent auditor here in Chicago. Less than 2 hours after my grandmother Vivian flatlined in her hospital room, I stood in the foyer of my family's Winnetka estate. There were no tears. There was no somber silence. Instead, I listened to the distinct pop of a vintage champagne cork echoing off the marble walls. My cousin Mason raised a crystal flute toward the empty leather armchair by the fireplace. Finally, he sneered. "The old bat is gone." I did not yell. I walked over and slapped the glass out of his hand. The crystal shattered, sending champagne soaking into the Persian rug. 2 days later, my family would learn that the empire they were toasting to was a trap. They thought they had won. They had no idea I held the only combination to a fireproof bank vault that would tear their lives apart. Before I explain how I legally dismantled my own family, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you know that the best revenge is simply letting toxic people destroy themselves. The air in the Winnetka house felt thick and heavy that night. I had driven straight from the hospital, the smell of sterile sheets still clinging to my coat. My parents had left the intensive care unit before the monitors even stopped beeping, claiming they needed to handle the arrangements. The arrangements apparently meant cracking open my grandmother's private wine cellar. My mother, Caroline, stepped over the broken glass on the rug. Her designer heels clicked sharply against the floor. She pointed a manicured finger at my chest. "You are going to clean that up, Harper," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "And then you are going to sit down and act like you belong to this family." I looked at her. 10 years ago, my parents threw me out of this very house because I refused to sign off on their fraudulent tax returns. I built my career from the ground up, working late nights analyzing financial discrepancies while they funded their country club lifestyle. Now they expected me to play the grieving daughter. "I am not cleaning anything," I said, keeping my tone dead level. "And I am leaving." Caroline narrowed her eyes. Her lips formed a tight, cruel line. "If you walk out that door tonight, do not expect a single dime when the estate is divided. You know how much this family is worth. We will cut you out so fast your head will spin." I glanced around the room. My father Richard stood near the wet bar staring at his shoes. He had always been a coward, letting my mother run the show while he hid behind a Scotch glass. Mason was brushing champagne off his trousers, muttering curses under his breath. They looked exactly like what they were. Vultures circling a carcass. "Keep your dirty money," I told my mother. I turned my back on them, pulled the heavy oak door open, and walked out into the freezing Chicago wind. I drove back to my apartment, convinced that I had severed the final thread tying me to the Davis family. I was wrong. The real war had not even started. 48 hours passed. I buried myself in client spreadsheets, pushing the memory of that night out of my mind. Then my phone rang. The caller ID showed the name Sterling Montgomery. He had been my grandmother Vivian's private attorney for over 2 decades. Harper Sterling said, skipping any polite introductions. His voice sounded strained, carrying a weight that made me set down my pen. "Your family is currently sitting in my office demanding I read the will. But we have a problem." I leaned back in my chair. "What kind of problem?" Vivian bypassed the standard inheritance protocol, Sterling explained. She transferred her core documents into a fireproof safe at the central bank. The safe requires a physical key and a unique numerical passcode. I have the key. I do not have the code. A cold chill settled in my chest. "Why are you calling me?" "Because—" Sterling paused, taking a slow breath. Vivian left specific instructions. She stated that the only person who knows the combination is you. She said she whispered it to you on your 18th birthday. My mind raced back 14 years. I pictured the garden behind the Winnetka estate. I pictured my grandmother pressing a small sealed envelope into my palm while my parents were busy entertaining their wealthy friends. I remembered the exact string of numbers she murmured into my ear before telling me to never forget them. "They are threatening to file a court order to drill the safe open." Sterling warned. "Caroline is furious. She claims you are withholding assets. I need you down here right now." I looked out my window at the city skyline. My family thought they had erased me. They thought they held all the power. They were about to find out that the woman they threw away was holding the keys to their entire existence. I grabbed my coat. "Tell them to wait," I said to Sterling. "I am on my way." The mahogany doors of Montgomery and Associates stood tall at the end of the corridor, projecting an aura of old Chicago money and ironclad legal discretion. I pushed them open and walked into the primary conference room. The air conditioning hummed, but the room felt suffocating. My family had already taken their seats around the long, polished table, dressed as if they were attending a high society charity gala rather than a morning assembly. My mother, Caroline, wore a tailored black Chanel suit, her pearls resting perfectly against her collarbone. She was tapping her manicured fingernails against the glass surface of the table, projecting an image of impatient grief. Beside her sat my father, Richard, his posture slouched, his eyes darting nervously toward the door. Across from them lounged my younger sister, Chloe, scrolling mindlessly on her phone. Next to Chloe sat her husband, Jamal Jackson. Jamal was a prominent investment fund manager, wearing a bespoke Navy suit and a Patek Philippe watch that caught the overhead light. He sat with the relaxed confidence of a man who believed he already owned every asset in the room. They all expected a simple reading. They expected Sterling Montgomery to hand out deeds to the vast Davis real estate empire, granting them the millions they needed to fund their lavish lifestyles. They stopped talking the second I walked in. "You took your time," Caroline said, her voice dripping with venom. "Sit down so we can get this over with. We have a press release to draft regarding the transition of the company leadership." I ignored her command and remained standing near the door. Sterling Montgomery entered from his private office carrying a heavy brass lockbox and a single manila envelope. He did not offer his condolences. He placed the items on the center of the glass table and took his seat. The room grew incredibly tense. Vivian Davis did not leave a traditional distribution of assets. Sterling began, his voice echoing off the glass walls. "The entirety of her estate, including the holding companies and liquid accounts, is locked behind a dual authentication legal trust. I hold the physical key to the bank vault where the final directives are kept. However, the vault requires a distinct numerical passcode to authorize the release of the contents." Caroline frowned, leaning forward. "Then type in the code, Sterling. Do your job." "I cannot," Sterling replied smoothly. "Vivian did not give me the code. She left strict legal instructions that the code is held by only one living person." Sterling turned his gaze toward me. The room followed his eyes. Chloe stopped scrolling on her phone. Richard wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead. Jamal shifted in his leather chair, the relaxed confidence vanishing from his posture. "Harper holds the code," Sterling stated. "Without her explicit authorization and physical presence at the vault, the estate remains frozen indefinitely." A heavy, suffocating silence blanketed the conference room. My mother stared at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and rising fury. The idea that my grandmother had bypassed her entirely to place the fate of the family empire into my hands was a reality she could not process. "Stop playing games!" Caroline hissed, slamming her palm on the table. "Give Sterling the numbers right now. You have no right to hold up family business." I looked at the woman who had cast me out into the Chicago winter a decade ago. "I do not take orders from you," I said. "I will open the vault when I am ready, and I will do it alone with Sterling." Jamal Jackson stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. He flashed a practiced diplomatic smile, stepping into his usual role as the family negotiator. He thought he could handle me the way he handled nervous investors. "Let us be rational here, Harper," Jamal said, his deep voice filling the room with false warmth. "We all know the history. You were kicked out of this family 10 years ago because you refused to cover up the discrepancies in your father's accounting books. You wanted to play the righteous auditor, and you paid the price. But holding the family hostage out of petty resentment is beneath you. Do not make this harder than it needs to be. Just hand over the code, and I will personally ensure you receive a generous consulting fee from the estate for your trouble." He was offering me a bribe with my own grandmother's money. I studied Jamal. As an independent auditor, I spent my days hunting down financial anomalies, reading between the lines of corporate bravado. I saw right through his bespoke suit. "You must be desperate, Jamal," I said, keeping my tone perfectly measured. "I read the latest quarterly reports for your investment fund. Your commercial real estate ventures are bleeding capital, and your leverage ratio is a disaster. You do not want this money to honor Vivian. You need this money to cover your margin calls before your investors figure out you are sinking." Jamal froze. The diplomatic smile melted off his face, replaced by a cold, calculating glare. He opened his mouth to retort, but my father suddenly broke. Richard leaped out of his chair, his face flushed red with panic. He was breathing heavily, the desperation rolling off him in waves. If the estate stayed frozen, whatever hidden debts he was harboring would crush him. "Give me the key!" Richard shouted, lunging across the glass table toward Sterling. He was not aiming for me. He was aiming for the brass lockbox sitting in front of the lawyer, foolishly believing that possessing the physical key would grant him leverage. Sterling stood up swiftly, pulling the box out of reach, but Richard grabbed a heavy glass water pitcher from the table and hurled it toward the wall to intimidate us. The glass shattered into hundreds of pieces, sending water splashing across the expensive carpet. Chloe shrieked and jumped back. Caroline grabbed her husband's arm, screaming at him to stop making a scene. I did not flinch. I took my cell phone from my pocket and dialed the front desk. "Send building security to conference room 4, I said calmly. "We have a hostile individual damaging property." "You ungrateful traitor!" Caroline screamed at me, her face twisting in rage as she struggled to hold my father back. "You are dead to us. You hear me? You are nothing." I watched them with clinical detachment. 2 large security guards rushed through the mahogany doors, immediately restraining my father and forcing him toward the exit. Jamal grabbed Chloe by the arm, dragging her out of the room to avoid being associated with the physical altercation. Caroline followed them, hurling insults over her shoulder until the heavy doors clicked shut, cutting off her voice. The conference room settled into a strange, ringing quiet. Water dripped from the shattered pitcher onto the floor. Sterling adjusted his tie, unbothered by the chaos, and gestured toward the private hallway connecting to the firm's secure vault room. "Shall we?" Sterling asked. We walked down a narrow, windowless corridor lined with reinforced steel doors. We entered a small, sterile room containing a heavy biometric safe bolted to the floor. Sterling inserted the physical key into the primary lock and turned it. The mechanism clicked loudly. He then stepped aside, gesturing to the digital keypad. I stepped forward. My hands felt cold, but my mind was incredibly clear. I pressed the digits my grandmother had whispered to me under the oak tree on my 18th birthday. The light on the keypad flashed green. The heavy steel door groaned as I pulled it open. I prepared myself to see stacks of bearer bonds, property deeds, or offshore bank account ledgers. I expected the keys to the Davis real estate empire. Instead, the safe was almost entirely empty. There was no money. There was no gold. Sitting in the center of the cold steel shelf was a single black encrypted flash drive. Beneath it rested a thick manila folder. I reached in and pulled the folder out, feeling the rough texture of the paper. Written across the front in my grandmother's unmistakable sharp handwriting were 2 words that made my blood run cold: Project Purge. I opened the cover. The first page was not a deed. It was a surveillance log. My grandmother had not left me an empire to inherit. She had left me a weapon. The drive back to my apartment in the Loop felt like moving through thick water. Rain lashed against the windshield of my car, blurring the neon lights of downtown Chicago. My high-security building normally provided a sense of sanctuary, a physical barrier between my meticulous life as an independent auditor and the toxic chaos of the Davis family. Tonight, the heavy steel door of my unit felt like a cage. I set the manila folder labeled Project Purge on my kitchen island. The encrypted flash drive felt heavy in my palm. I sat down at my workstation, bypassed my own firewall security protocols, and inserted the drive into my laptop. The decryption required the same combination my grandmother had given me 14 years ago. The screen blinked, loading a directory filled with thousands of files: financial ledgers, wire transfer records, offshore account routing numbers, and a single video file named for you, Harper. I clicked play. My grandmother Vivian appeared on the screen, sitting in the very leather armchair where my cousin Mason had disrespectfully toasted to her death just 48 hours prior. She looked thinner than I remembered, her silver hair pulled back severely, but her eyes possessed a sharp, unyielding clarity. The family had spent years whispering to anyone who would listen that Vivian's mind was failing, laying the groundwork to seize control of her assets. They had vastly underestimated her. Harper Vivian began, her voice steady and commanding, showing no signs of the frailty the family had claimed. If you are watching this, it means I am gone, and the vultures are already circling the estate. They think I grew weak and forgetful. They think I did not see what they were doing. She leaned closer to the camera. For the past 5 years, I employed a private intelligence firm to track every dollar flowing through the Davis holding companies. Your father, your mother, Jamal, and Mason, they have been bleeding the business dry. They set up shell corporations in the Cayman Islands. They funneled operational capital into high-risk hedge funds to cover Jamal's bad bets. They forged property deeds and falsified tax returns. I felt my heart begin to hammer against my ribs. This was not a simple case of corporate mismanagement. This was systemic, organized fraud on a multi-million-dollar scale. Harper. My grandmother's voice softened, breaking the rigid facade just a fraction. You are the only one who refused to sell your conscience. 10 years ago, you chose to walk away with nothing, rather than cover up your father's initial crimes. I saw your strength then. I need that strength now. The documents on this drive contain every piece of evidence necessary to expose them. They hollowed out the company from the inside. Do not let them escape the consequences. The video ended, leaving a static screen that illuminated my dark apartment. I stared at the reflection of my own face on the monitor. A heavy, suffocating realization settled over me. This was not about inheriting wealth. This was an execution order, and Vivian had chosen me to pull the lever. Before I could even process the magnitude of the financial data waiting in the folders, the shrill, piercing sound of my apartment's security intercom shattered the silence. I jumped, my heart racing. I checked the video feed from the lobby camera. My younger sister Chloe stood there wrapped in a designer trench coat, looking nervous and out of place. Beside her stood Jamal, his face fixed in a calm, practiced expression. They had bypassed the doorman. I pressed the intercom button. How did you get into the building? Jamal's voice crackled through the speaker, smooth and unbothered. I manage the investment portfolio for the property management company that owns this high-rise Harper. Gaining access was trivial. Please let us come up. We just want to talk. No lawyers, no yelling, just family. I debated ignoring them and calling the police, but I needed to know how much they knew and how far they were willing to go. I buzzed them up. I quickly ejected the flash drive, slipped it into my pocket, and slid the Project Purge folder into a hidden compartment under my desk. When I opened my apartment door, Jamal and Chloe stepped inside. Chloe refused to make eye contact, busying herself by looking at my minimalist furniture. Jamal, however, walked straight into the living room, taking in the space with a patronizing nod. Cozy place, Jamal noted, running a hand along the edge of my sofa, but clearly beneath someone with your talents. Cut the performance, Jamal, I said, leaning against the kitchen counter, keeping a safe distance. You broke into my building. State your business and get out. He smiled, a cold, calculating gesture that did not reach his eyes. He reached into the inner breast pocket of his bespoke suit and withdrew a sleek, embossed checkbook. He unscrewed a fountain pen, scribbled across the paper, tore the check free, and laid it gently on the granite countertop between us. I glanced down. It was a certified cashier's check made out to me. $500,000. We got off on the wrong foot at the lawyer's office, Jamal said, his tone shifting into the smooth cadence he used to close hostile mergers. Richard was overly emotional. Caroline was stressed. We understand that you feel slighted by the past, but holding a grudge is bad for business, Harper. I looked from the check to his face. And what exactly am I selling for $500,000? Whatever you took from that vault today, Jamal answered smoothly. We know the safe was practically empty. We know Vivian did not leave you the liquid assets. She left you leverage. Hand over the contents, sign a non-disclosure agreement regarding the estate proceedings, and this check clears tonight. You can expand your auditing firm, buy a better apartment, move on with your life. I stared at the 6 figures written in black ink. 10 years ago, my family threw me onto the street for refusing to sign a fraudulent document. Now they were standing in my home offering me blood money to look the other way while they dismantled my grandmother's legacy. Chloe finally spoke up, her voice trembling slightly. Just take it, Harper. Please. You do not understand the kind of pressure Jamal is under. The fund needs the capital from the estate sale. If you stall the probate process, everything collapses. Just take the money and leave us alone. I reached out and picked up the check. Jamal's smile widened, assuming he had won. He assumed I was driven by the same shallow greed that governed the rest of the Davis family. I grabbed the edges of the heavy paper and ripped it precisely in half. Then I stacked the pieces and ripped them again, letting the torn fragments fall like snow onto the granite counter. Jamal's smile vanished instantly. His jaw tightened, the muscles ticking beneath his skin. "You cannot buy me, Jamal," I said, my voice cold and unwavering. "I do not want your money. I want you out of my house." Chloe gasped, stepping backward toward the door. Jamal remained perfectly still, his dark eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that bordered on lethal. "You are making a very foolish mistake, Harper." Jamal warned, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "You think because you are an independent auditor you are untouchable. You operate in a corporate world built on reputation. I control capital that flows through half the firms in Chicago. I can make one phone call and ensure no reputable business ever hires you again. I can crush your career by morning." I met his gaze without flinching. "You are welcome to try. Now get out." Jamal stared at me for 3 agonizing seconds. Then, without breaking eye contact, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his smartphone. He did not say another word. He simply typed a brief text message, hit send, and slid the phone back into his jacket. "Let us go, Chloe," Jamal commanded. He turned and walked out the door, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. Chloe scurried after him, shooting me one last terrified glance before the heavy steel door clicked shut. I stood alone in the quiet apartment, the shredded pieces of the check scattered across the counter. My pulse raced. I had drawn a line in the sand, and Jamal had clearly retaliated. I walked over to my desk and opened my laptop. I needed to move funds from my primary checking account to an encrypted offshore reserve I kept for emergencies. I logged into my banking portal and initiated the transfer. A red error message flashed across the screen. "Transaction denied. Account suspended." I frowned, refreshing the page. I tried a different account, my business operating fund, my savings, my emergency line of credit. Every single portal returned the exact same glaring red text. "Account suspended. Contact your administrator." Panic flared in my chest. I grabbed my phone and dialed the automated banking service. The robotic voice confirmed my worst fear. My accounts were not just frozen. They had been flagged under a high-priority legal hold. Jamal had not just threatened my career. He and my mother had leveraged their immense financial power and legal connections to execute a coordinated strike. They had frozen every cent to my name. They were going to starve me out before I could expose them. The red text on my monitor felt less like a digital error and more like a physical blow. Jamal and my mother had executed a coordinated financial strike, and they did it with breathtaking speed. My inbox chimed. A PDF attachment arrived from a Cook County court clerk. It was an ex parte emergency injunction. I scanned the legal jargon, my blood running cold as I read the allegations. Caroline and Jamal had accused me of financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. They twisted my possession of Vivian's vault code into a narrative of elder abuse, convincing a late-night judge that I was liquidating my grandmother's assets to flee the state. By framing me as a predator, they weaponized the justice system to sever my access to capital. I had no credit cards. My checking accounts were locked. My business payroll was frozen. If I needed to hire a defense attorney, buy groceries, or pay rent, I was entirely cut off. They wanted to starve me out, forcing me to crawl back and trade the Project Purge flash drive for my livelihood. They miscalculated. I track hidden money for a living. I map offshore diversions and hunt down laundered corporate funds. You cannot freeze an auditor who knows how to build ghost ledgers. I opened a secure terminal on my laptop and routed my connection through a proxy server. I bypassed my primary financial portfolio and accessed a dormant, unlinked digital wallet. It contained just enough untraceable funds to keep me moving. But to access the real leverage, I needed a physical location. The necessity triggered a visceral memory. I was 18 years old, standing in the suffocating mahogany library of the Winnetka house. Richard and Caroline were screaming at me. I had just announced my decision to major in accounting rather than corporate law. My father threw a crystal paperweight against the wall. He demanded I attend law school to protect the family business from regulatory oversight. When I refused to become his legal shield, Caroline told me to pack my bags. As I walked out of that library, my grandmother Vivian was waiting in the dimly lit hallway. She did not offer empty comfort. Instead, she slipped a plain, unbranded debit card into the pocket of my coat. Delaware. Vivian had whispered, her eyes fierce and uncompromising, for when you finally run. I had kept that card hidden in the lining of my briefcase for 14 years. I retrieved it now. The plastic was worn, bearing only a routing sequence and a specialized account number. I grabbed a small duffel bag, packed 3 days of clothes, and threw the Project Purge flash drive into a hidden seam. Using my untraceable digital wallet, I booked the cheapest red-eye flight to Philadelphia, the closest major transit hub to Wilmington, Delaware. I left my primary cell phone on the kitchen counter to prevent Jamal from tracking my GPS coordinates, relying instead on a prepaid burner I kept for secure client communications. The flight was turbulent, mirroring the adrenaline coursing through my veins. When the wheels touched down on the East Coast tarmac, the morning sky was the color of bruised iron. I stepped off the jet bridge and joined the river of exhausted travelers moving toward the main terminal. My senses were operating on high alert. Years of conducting hostile audits teach you to notice anomalies in an environment. As I reached the top of the escalator overlooking the baggage claim, I saw them. 2 men in tailored dark coats stood near the exit columns. They were not waiting for luggage. Their posture was rigid, their eyes scanning the descending passengers with systematic precision. Jamal did not rely solely on legal maneuvers. He had deployed corporate fixers to ensure I did not reach whatever assets I was trying to secure. One of the men locked eyes with me. He tapped an earpiece, nudged his partner, and they began moving in my direction. My chest tightened. I did not run. Running triggers a chase response. I matched the pace of a large tour group slipping into the center of the crowd. I navigated past the carousel, keeping my head down, my breath shallow and controlled. I glanced over my shoulder. The fixers were cutting through the crowd, closing the distance effortlessly. They were professionals unaffected by the chaotic flow of the airport. I needed a blind spot. Up ahead, a janitorial cart rested against a heavy gray door marked "Authorized Personnel Only." The latch was propped open by a fraction of an inch, likely left by a careless maintenance worker. I veered sharply to the left, putting a pillar between myself and the fixers. In one fluid motion, I slipped through the gray door and pulled it shut behind me, engaging the heavy deadbolt just as footsteps pounded past on the other side. I found myself in a subterranean concrete corridor. The air smelled of industrial bleach and aviation fuel. I moved quickly down the shadowy hall, navigating a labyrinth of utility pipes and storage rooms until I reached an unmarked exit door. Pushing it open, I emerged onto a loading dock on the opposite end of the airport, far away from the passenger pickup zones. I hailed a passing transit cab, gave the driver an extra $100 bill, and told him to drive straight to Wilmington. An hour later, I stood inside the hushed, climate-controlled lobby of a boutique financial institution on Market Street. I presented the unbranded debit card to a teller who inspected the magnetic strip, made a quick phone call, and escorted me to a secure private viewing room in the basement. A bank officer entered a few minutes later, carrying a thick, sealed leather dossier. "This has been held in trust under your biometric signature since your 18th birthday," the officer said, sliding the dossier across the table. The door clicked shut, leaving me alone in the silent room. I broke the wax seal on the leather flap. Inside, I expected to find a hidden trust fund emergency cash, or perhaps deeds to secondary properties. What I found was a legal masterstroke that altered the very foundation of the Davis family empire. I spread the documents across the table. They were articles of incorporation drafted in secrecy by Vivian over a decade ago. My family always boasted about owning Davis Real Estate, LLC. They paraded the company name around Chicago, leveraging its commercial properties to secure loans for Jamal's investment fund. But the paperwork in front of me revealed a structural reality they had entirely missed. Davis Real Estate, LLC was not an independent entity. It was a subsidiary. Vivian had quietly transferred the overarching ownership of the entire portfolio into a blind holding company registered in Delaware. My mother, my father, and Jamal were merely listed as operational directors of the subsidiary. They held titles, but they did not hold the ultimate authority. I turned to the final page of the incorporation charter. My eyes scanned the voting rights allocation. Vivian had not named herself as the primary shareholder. She had named me. I sat back in the chair, the sheer magnitude of the discovery washing over me. I was the sole voting shareholder of the master entity. I possessed the unilateral legal power to dissolve the subsidiary, fire the board of directors, or liquidate the entire portfolio without requiring a single signature from my parents. They thought they had frozen my life by locking my bank accounts. They had no idea I possessed the authority to freeze their entire corporate existence. I gathered the documents, my hands steady, my mind sharp. It was time to return to Chicago. I was no longer running. I was going to hunt. The silence of the Delaware viewing room was shattered by the harsh buzz of my burner phone. It was an automated news alert I had set up years ago to track the Davis family's public business movements. I tapped the screen and opened the link. A high-definition photo of my mother Caroline and my brother-in-law Jamal dominated the screen. They were standing behind a podium adorned with the Davis Real Estate LLC logo, smiling for the cameras. The headline read, "Chicago Real Estate Giant Announces Historic Acquisition by Vanguard Capital Partners." I skimmed the article, my jaw tightening with every paragraph. The deal was structured as an expedited merger. Vanguard Capital was acquiring the Davis commercial portfolio for $50 million in cash. Caroline spun the narrative perfectly, claiming the sale was a strategic move to honor Vivian's legacy and transition the family focus toward philanthropic endeavors. It was a flawless, polished lie. I knew the truth. Vanguard Capital specialized in aggressive liquidations. Jamal and Caroline were orchestrating a fire sale to bury the evidence of their embezzlement before the probate court caught wind of the missing funds. They intended to take the $50 million payoff Jamal's disastrous margin calls and vanish into early retirement, leaving the hollowed-out corporate shell to collapse on its own. The article mentioned a closing gala scheduled for Friday night at the Ritz-Carlton to finalize the signatures. That gave me less than 72 hours to dismantle a corporate transaction involving two massive financial entities. I packed the incorporation documents back into the leather dossier, locked the briefcase, and walked out of the bank. I hailed a cab to the nearest secure Wi-Fi hotspot, a quiet coffee shop off Market Street. I ordered a black coffee, opened my laptop, and initiated a secure encrypted video call with Sterling Montgomery. The lawyer's face appeared on my screen a few moments later. He looked exhausted, rubbing his temples as if fighting off a migraine. Harper Sterling sighed, leaning into the camera. "The injunction they filed against you is aggressive. They have frozen your assets and petitioned the court to appoint Jamal as the interim executor of the estate, citing your refusal to cooperate. If he gets that power, he will authorize the Vanguard merger before the ink is even dry. He cannot authorize the merger," I stated, keeping my voice steady. I pulled the Delaware documents from the briefcase and held them up to the camera lens. Davis Real Estate is an LLC. It is a subsidiary. The master holding company possesses the sole authority to execute a sale, and I hold 100% of the voting rights. Sterling squinted at the screen, his legal mind analyzing the implications in real time. A slow, incredulous smile spread across his face. "Vivian outmaneuvered them from the grave," he murmured. "She structured it as a trap." "Exactly," I replied. "I need you to draft a federal injunction. We file it under the holding company's name, halting the Vanguard acquisition based on unauthorized executive action. I will hand-deliver it to the closing gala on Friday." Sterling's smile vanished, replaced by stark concern. "Harper, think this through. If you walk into that gala and publicly humiliate Vanguard Capital, Caroline will not just fight you in court. She controls the narrative. Jamal has the press in his pocket. They will launch a media smear campaign painting you as a disgruntled, estranged daughter trying to extort her grieving family. They will drag your auditing firm through the mud. You will win the company, but your professional reputation will be destroyed." I looked at the lawyer. 10 years ago, I walked away quietly to protect my reputation. I let them control the story. That ends tonight. Draft the injunction, Sterling. I will handle the optics. I ended the call, closed my laptop, and booked a return flight to Chicago. I was no longer hiding. I was preparing for a public execution. I arrived back at my apartment building late that evening. My building manager had removed the security hold, likely because Jamal believed I was neutralized by the asset freeze. As I walked down the quiet hallway toward my unit, I noticed something anomalous. A plain manila envelope rested on the floor, propped against my doorframe. It lacked a postage stamp or a return address. It had been hand-delivered bypassing the doorman. I unlocked my apartment, stepped inside, and threw the deadbolt. I dropped my briefcase on the kitchen island and picked up the envelope. The paper was stiff, premium quality. I sliced the flap open with a letter opener. A stack of glossy photographs spilled onto the granite counter. I picked up the first image. My breath caught in my throat. It was a telephoto shot of me sitting in a dimly lit restaurant booth, engaged in deep conversation with a man named Elias Thorne. The second photo showed me shaking his hand. The third photo captured me handing him a thick folder. Elias Thorne was the CEO of Thorne Logistics, the primary cutthroat competitor of the Davis family empire. We had met 2 months ago. I had audited his supply chain operations as a freelance consultant. It was a standard ethical business transaction. But out of context, the photos told a devastating story. To a casual observer or a hungry journalist, the images depicted the estranged Davis daughter secretly handing over proprietary family documents to their biggest rival. It looked like corporate espionage. A single sheet of heavy cardstock accompanied the photographs. The message was printed in sharp block letters. "We know you went to Delaware. You have 24 hours to surrender the voting rights. If you interfere with the Vanguard merger, these photos go to the Chicago Tribune, the Wall Street Journal, and the Ethics Board of the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants. Your career ends before the ink dries on the Vanguard contract. Stand down." The threat was clear. They had anticipated my legal maneuver and prepared a counterstrike designed to annihilate my professional credibility. If those photos were published, no major firm would ever hire me to audit their books again. I would be radioactive. I stared at the photographs, my mind racing through the variables. Caroline was vicious, but she lacked the tactical patience for corporate blackmail. My father lacked the spine. This was Jamal's handiwork. He had leveraged his private fixers to monitor my movements even before my grandmother's death. I examined the third photograph closely. The lighting, the angle, the slight reflection of a street lamp in the window pane. I recognized the restaurant. It was an upscale steakhouse in the Loop. I had booked that meeting using my secure burner phone. I had told no one about the consultation. A cold realization struck me. The leak did not come from my end. I pulled out a magnifying glass from my desk drawer and scrutinized the edge of the photograph. The image was incredibly sharp, captured from a high vantage point across the street. The angle matched the second-floor window of a private wealth management firm, Jamal's firm. He had not hired a private investigator to follow me. He had orchestrated the meeting from his own office. He had used his access to Thorne's financial calendar to anticipate the location and set up the surveillance shot. My burner phone buzzed against the granite counter, vibrating violently. I jumped the sudden noise, shattering the quiet tension of the apartment. I stared at the screen. The caller ID displayed an unknown number routed through a masked IP address. I picked up the phone and accepted the call. I did not speak. Harper. A hushed, frantic voice whispered through the receiver. It was a man, his breathing ragged, sounding terrified. Listen to me. Do not hang up. Jamal is moving the Vanguard signing up by 24 hours. They are finalizing the deal tomorrow night. Who is this? I demanded, my voice sharp. The line crackled with static. You do not know me, but I know what you found in Delaware. I know what Jamal is doing. If you want to stop him, you need the original ledgers. The unredacted books. I have them. Why are you helping me? I asked, gripping the edge of the counter. Because Jamal is planning to pin the embezzlement on me when Vanguard audits the subsidiary, the man replied, panic bleeding into his words. I refuse to take the fall for his crimes. I will give you the ledgers, but we have to move now. He knows you are back in Chicago. Name a place, I said. Lower level of the Millennium Park Garage, Section G. 1 hour. Come alone. The line went dead. I stared at the phone. It was a classic setup. Jamal had likely traced my return flight, sent the blackmail photos to rattle me, and was now baiting a trap to secure the Delaware documents. Walking into an underground parking garage to meet an anonymous caller was tactical suicide. But if the caller was telling the truth, those ledgers were the final nail in Jamal's coffin. The Delaware documents proved I had the authority to stop the sale. The unredacted ledgers proved why the sale was criminal. I grabbed my coat, shoved the burner phone into my pocket, and headed for the door. I was walking straight into the fire. The Millennium Park underground garage at 2 a.m. is a concrete tomb. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting long erratic shadows between the concrete support pillars. The air smelled of exhaust fumes and damp concrete. I kept my footsteps light, navigating through rows of empty parked cars toward Section G. My senses were heightened, registering every echo, every distant rumble of a passing train above ground. I reached the designated sector. A sleek, unassuming black sedan idled near the far wall, its headlights off. The engine purred softly. As I approached, the driver's side door opened. A man stepped out, moving with anxious, erratic energy. He was Marcus, a brilliant Ivy League-educated financial analyst who had served as Jamal's right-hand man for 5 years. I recognized him from the few corporate galas I had tolerated before my exile. He was always standing a respectful distance behind Jamal, holding a tablet managing the logistics, while Jamal soaked up the spotlight. Tonight, the polished professional demeanor was gone. He wore a rumpled hoodie, his eyes darting frantically toward the ramp entrance. "You came," Marcus breathed, scanning the shadows behind me. He looked terrified. His hands were shaking as he clutched a heavy leather messenger bag to his chest. "I do not take meetings in underground garages for my health, Marcus," I said, maintaining a calm, authoritative stance. "You said you had the unredacted ledgers. Hand them over." Marcus hesitated, gripping the bag tighter. He stepped closer, lowering his voice to a frantic whisper. "Jamal is a sociopath, Harper. He structured the Vanguard deal to trigger an automatic audit post-acquisition, but he manipulated the liability clauses. When Vanguard finds the $50 million hole in the accounts, the paper trail will bypass him completely. The digital fingerprints lead straight to my administrative credentials. He is setting me up to take the fall for a decade of federal tax evasion. Why come to me, I asked. Why not go straight to the SEC? Because the SEC takes months to build a case, Marcus replied bitterly. Jamal controls Vanguard's compliance officers. He will execute the merger tomorrow, liquidate the funds into untraceable offshore trusts by midnight, and I will be arrested by Monday morning. You are the only one who can legally block the sale before the ink dries. Marcus unclasped the messenger bag and pulled out a thick leather-bound ledger. It looked archaic, an anachronism in a world of digital finance. Jamal does not trust cloud servers for the real numbers, Marcus explained, shoving the ledger into my hands. This is the master log. It contains the raw data for every shell company, every phantom property deed, every offshore wire transfer. It proves Caroline and Jamal orchestrated the entire scheme. Take it. Stop the merger. I grasped the heavy ledger, feeling the weight of my family's corruption in my hands. I had the smoking gun. Suddenly, the piercing wail of police sirens shattered the quiet of the garage. Tires screeched on the concrete ramp above us. Red and blue lights flashed frantically against the walls, descending rapidly toward our level. The screeching intensified as multiple patrol cars accelerated down the spiral incline. Marcus's face drained of color. "He set us up," he yelled, panic seizing his voice. He knew I accessed the safe. He flagged the ledger with a tracking chip. He called the police and reported a corporate theft in progress. "If they catch you with that book, you go to jail for industrial espionage." "We cannot be caught together," I shouted over the approaching sirens. "Run!" Marcus did not hesitate. He sprinted toward the pedestrian stairwell, his footsteps echoing wildly against the concrete. I shoved the heavy ledger into my duffel bag and turned toward the opposite exit. The first patrol car drifted around the corner, its high beams illuminating the section. A spotlight swept across the concrete pillars, searching the shadows. I ducked behind a massive steel support beam, pressing my back flat against the cold surface. 2 officers exited the vehicle, their hands resting on their holstered weapons. "Spread out," one of them ordered. "Security desk reported unauthorized access and potential theft. Check the perimeter." I calculated my options. The pedestrian exit was 50 yards away across an open lane bathed in harsh light. The elevator bank was closer, but it would require a key card for late-night access, and the doors took too long to close. I glanced at the floor plan painted on the pillar beside me. There was an emergency ventilation shaft adjacent to the elevator bank, designed for maintenance access to the subway tunnels below. It was a narrow, dangerous escape route, but it was my only option. I waited until the officers moved down the aisle, their flashlights sweeping the parked cars. Taking a deep breath, I sprinted across the open lane, my rubber-soled shoes making almost no sound on the concrete. I reached the ventilation access door, grabbed the heavy iron handle, and pulled. It was locked. Footsteps echoed behind me, growing louder. "Hey! Stop right there!" an officer yelled. Adrenaline surged through my veins. I pulled a small, hardened steel lockpick set from my pocket, a skill I learned years ago to access forgotten filing cabinets during hostile audits. I jammed the tension wrench into the keyway, manipulating the pins with frantic precision. The footsteps were closing in. Click. The heavy door gave way. I threw myself inside, pulling the door shut, just as the beam of a flashlight struck the metal surface. I threw the internal deadbolt, plunging myself into absolute darkness. I navigated the cramped, dusty shaft by touch, descending a rusted iron ladder until I reached the subway access tunnel. The roar of a passing train vibrated through the concrete walls. I emerged onto a deserted platform, blending into the late-night commuter crowd, the duffel bag clutched tightly to my chest. I had escaped. I had the master ledger. An hour later, I sat in the safety of a secure windowless office space rented under a pseudonym. I placed the leather-bound ledger on the desk, turned on a high-intensity desk lamp, and opened the cover. I needed to extract the exact account numbers to draft the federal injunction. I turned to the first page. The page was entirely blank. I frowned, flipping to the second page. Blank. The third. Blank. I riffled through the entire book. Every single page was completely empty. A cold dread settled in my stomach. I examined the thick leather binding closely. Running my fingers along the inner spine, I felt a slight unnatural ridge. I pulled a utility knife from my bag and carefully sliced the leather seam. A hidden compartment revealed a digital display embedded within the back cover. The ledger was not a book. It was a sophisticated biometric storage device disguised as an archaic logbook. The small LCD screen glowed to life, displaying a single glowing fingerprint scanner. Below the scanner, a digital prompt blinked rhythmically. Primary authorization required. Richard Davis. I stared at the screen, my mind racing to comprehend the obstacle. Jamal was paranoid, but he was also meticulous. He did not trust Marcus, and he certainly did not trust Caroline. He had engineered the master ledger to require a biometric override from the one person in the family who held the official title of CEO, yet lacked the spine to ever question the finances. My father. Richard was the puppet CEO. Jamal had bound the evidence of the embezzlement to Richard's thumbprint, ensuring that if the authorities ever seized the ledger, Richard would be the one biologically linked to the crime. The implications were devastating. The Delaware documents gave me the authority to halt the Vanguard merger, but without the unredacted account numbers locked inside this biometric device, I could not prove the fraud to the federal judge. The injunction would be thrown out as a frivolous family dispute, and the sale would proceed. I needed my father's thumbprint. Richard was a coward. He spent his life avoiding conflict, hiding behind his title, while Caroline and Jamal dictated his every move. Approaching him directly meant risking exposure to my mother's wrath. He would panic. He would alert Jamal. He would never willingly hand over his biometric signature to the daughter he had exiled. I looked at the glowing screen. The closing gala was scheduled for tomorrow evening. Time was no longer slipping away. It had effectively vanished. I picked up the ledger and slipped it back into my duffel bag. I could not negotiate with my father. I could not reason with him. I had to corner him, break his psychological defenses, and force him to choose between his domineering wife and his own survival. I had to execute a hostile audit on my own flesh and blood. The morning air at the Oak Brook Country Club carried a crisp chill smelling of damp earth and freshly cut grass. My father always played a solo round of golf on Thursday mornings. It was his scheduled escape from Caroline, a quiet routine where he could pretend he was the master of his own universe. I parked my rented sedan near the service entrance, bypassed the clubhouse security by walking through the maintenance paths, and navigated the tree line toward the 9th hole. Richard Davis stood on the manicured green lining up a putt. He wore a pristine white polo shirt and gray slacks, the very picture of idle wealth. He pulled the putter back, focused entirely on the small white ball. I stepped out from the shadow of the oak trees. "Your stance is too rigid," I said, my voice cutting through the quiet morning. "You are going to hook it left." Richard jerked upward, dropping his expensive titanium club onto the grass. He spun around, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and immediate irritation. He looked around frantically to see if any of his wealthy peers were watching. "Harper," he hissed, marching toward me with his hands clenched into fists. "What are you doing here? You are barred from the estate. You are barred from the company. You cannot just walk onto a private course to harass me. I am not here to harass you," I said, keeping my posture relaxed and unbothered. "I am here to offer you a way out." I reached into my coat and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a summary page I had extracted from the Delaware Holding Company documents cross-referenced with the public filings of the Vanguard acquisition. I held it out to him. He refused to take it, crossing his arms over his chest. "I do not want to see your fabricated spreadsheets. Jamal warned me you would try to manipulate the narrative. You always want to destroy what this family builds." I let the paper flutter to the ground, landing near the toe of his golf shoe. "Look at the payout structure, Richard. Look at the liability clauses Caroline and your golden son-in-law drafted. Vanguard is purchasing the assets, but they are leaving the LLC shell intact. And who is the sole registered director of that shell?" Richard glared at me, refusing to look down. "I am the chief executive officer. You are the fall guy," I corrected him, stepping closer so he could not avoid my gaze. "Caroline and Jamal are routing the $50 million buyout into an offshore trust under their names. They structured the contract so the existing tax liabilities and the $50 million operational deficit remain firmly attached to the LLC. When the IRS and the Securities and Exchange Commission realize the books are cooked, Jamal will be sipping margaritas in St. Bart's. You will be sitting in a federal penitentiary." Richard opened his mouth to argue, but his eyes betrayed him. He glanced down at the paper on the grass. He knew his wife. He knew how cold Caroline could be. The realization hit him like a physical strike. "That is absurd," he stammered, his voice losing its arrogant edge. "Caroline would never allow Jamal to isolate me. I am her husband. I built that company alongside her." "You abandoned your own daughter to protect an empire," I said, twisting the knife into his fragile ego. "Did you really think they would not throw you away the moment you outlived your usefulness? You are nothing to them but a signature on a liability form." His face flushed with indignation, but his hands were trembling. He bent down and picked up the paper, his eyes scanning the highlighted sections. His breathing grew shallow. I could see the exact moment the delusion shattered. He realized he was standing on a trapdoor, and Jamal was holding the rope. I pulled the heavy leather-bound biometric ledger from my bag and held it out. This device contains the unredacted master logs I explained. It holds the proof of Jamal orchestrating the embezzlement. With this data, I can file a federal injunction and halt the Vanguard merger tonight. I can save you from federal prison. But Jamal encrypted it. It requires your thumbprint to unlock. Scan your print, hand it back to me, and I will tear down the trap they set for you. Richard stared at the glowing biometric scanner on the back of the ledger. He reached a trembling hand toward it, his thumb hovering mere inches from the glass. Then he stopped. He pulled his hand back, his face twisting in raw terror. "No," he whispered, taking a step away from me. "If Caroline finds out I cooperated with you, she will destroy me. She will freeze my personal accounts. She will drag my name through the mud. I cannot cross her." He was paralyzed by fear. His dread of my mother eclipsed his instinct for self-preservation. He turned around, picked up his putter, and walked toward his golf cart, leaving the paper lying on the green. I watched his retreating back, feeling a deep, hollow disgust. "You are a coward, Richard." I followed him to the golf cart. I did not argue further. I simply tossed the heavy leather ledger into the wire basket mounted on the back of his cart. "When you realize I am telling the truth," I said, keeping my voice dangerously calm, "you know what to do. The device is programmed to auto-sync the decrypted files to a secure cloud server the moment your thumbprint is registered." Richard refused to look at me. He gripped the steering wheel of the cart, his knuckles white. While his attention was fixed straight ahead, I subtly reached into my pocket, retrieved a micro-audio transmitter the size of a coin, and slipped it deep into the side zipper pocket of his leather golf bag. I turned and walked back toward the tree line, leaving him alone on the course. The plan seemed like a failure on the surface. I had not secured the decrypted files. But I knew human nature. I knew that planting a seed of doubt in the mind of a narcissist was like dropping a match into dry brush. Hours later, the sun dipped below the Chicago skyline. I sat in my secure office space, a pair of noise-canceling headphones resting over my ears. A digital audio interface glowed on my monitor, receiving the live feed from the transmitter hidden in Richard's golf bag. For most of the afternoon, I heard nothing but the dull hum of tires on asphalt, the clinking of golf clubs, and the mundane chatter of the country club locker room. But as evening approached, the ambient noise shifted. I heard the heavy thud of the Winnetka estate front door closing. I heard Richard's heavy footsteps echoing on marble floors. The sound of a crystal decanter clinking against a glass told me he was drinking heavily. Then another set of footsteps entered the room. Firm, confident, Richard. Jamal's smooth voice filtered through the audio feed. "Caroline tells me you missed the final briefing for the Ritz-Carlton Gala. We need you sober and presentable tonight. The Vanguard executives are expecting the patriarch to shake their hands before we sign the transfer deeds." There was a long, heavy pause. I leaned closer to the monitor, pressing the headphones tight against my ears. "Tell me about the severance liability clause," Richard demanded, his words slurring slightly from the alcohol. I reviewed the summary. "The operational debt remains with the LLC. The payout routes to the offshore entity you established with Caroline. You are leaving me holding the bag." A sharp, mocking laugh echoed through the transmitter. Jamal did not even try to deny it. He dropped the respectful son-in-law persona instantly. "You read the summary?" Jamal sounded genuinely amused. "I am surprised you comprehended the terminology. Let us drop the pretense, old man. You are a figurehead. You have always been a figurehead. Caroline runs this family and I run the capital. You show up, you smile for the cameras, and you sign where we tell you to sign. I am the CEO. Richard shouted, his voice cracking with wounded pride. "I built the foundation of this company. You cannot cut me out of the exit strategy. I will not sign the Vanguard merger. You will sign whatever we put in front of you," Jamal replied, his tone dropping to a lethal quiet register. "Because if you do not, Caroline has already drafted divorce papers citing irreconcilable financial negligence. She will take the house, the cars, and the country club memberships. She will leave you with nothing but the clothes on your back and a mountain of unpaid vendor invoices. You are a joke, Richard. A placeholder we kept around for optics. Now sober up and put your tuxedo on." Footsteps receded as Jamal walked out of the room, slamming the heavy study door behind him. I held my breath. The audio feed captured the sound of ragged, heavy breathing. Richard was hyperventilating, his entire worldview collapsing under the weight of Jamal's vicious humiliation. The illusion of his power was gone. He had been reduced to an expendable pawn in his own home. Then I heard a different sound, the rasp of a metal zipper being pulled open, the shifting of leather. A high-pitched electronic beep echoed through the earpiece. The biometric scanner booting up. My heart hammered against my ribs. I switched my monitor display from the audio feed to my secure cloud server directory. The screen was empty. "Come on," I whispered to the empty room. "Do it. Prove you have at least 1 ounce of pride left." Another electronic beep sounded over the audio feed, then a low mechanical hum. On my monitor, a progress bar suddenly materialized. Decryption initiated, transferring master logs. 10%, 30%, 50%. The data was flooding into my secure server. Richard had pressed his thumb to the scanner. Driven by pure, unadulterated spite, he chose to burn down the empire rather than let Jamal humiliate him. Suddenly, a loud crash shattered the audio feed. The study door was kicked open. "What the hell are you doing?" Jamal roared. The progress bar on my screen hit 80%. "Get away from me," Richard yelled, his voice laced with panic. The sound of a physical struggle erupted. Heavy objects crashed to the floor. Glass shattered. "Give me that book," Jamal shouted. 95%. A loud thud echoed through the transmitter, followed by a sharp groan of pain from my father. 100%. Transfer complete. I slammed my hand down on the keyboard, instantly locking the downloaded files behind a biometric firewall of my own. I had the unredacted master ledgers. I had the offshore routing numbers. I had the definitive proof of their decade-long financial crimes. Over the audio feed, I heard Jamal breathing heavily. He had wrestled the ledger away from Richard, but he was too late. "You stupid, pathetic old man," Jamal hissed. "You just signed your own death warrant." A door slammed shut, followed by the distinctive click of a heavy deadbolt sliding into place. Jamal had locked Richard inside the study. I pulled the headphones off the silence of my office, rushing back in. I had the ammunition required to secure the federal injunction. But looking at the clock on my wall, a new terrifying reality set in. The closing gala at the Ritz-Carlton was starting in exactly 2 hours. Caroline had hired an army of private security contractors to guard the event, ensuring no unwanted guests disrupted the $50 million signing ceremony. Having the evidence on a server meant nothing if the Vanguard executives signed the binding acquisition contracts before I could present it. I needed to get a federal judge to sign an emergency stay print, the legal mandate, and physically breach the most heavily guarded ballroom in Chicago. I grabbed my coat and my briefcase. The psychological warfare was over. The physical confrontation was about to begin. The digital clock on my dashboard glared bright red, displaying 7:15 in the evening. I sat in the passenger seat of Sterling Montgomery's sedan as we sped through the rain-slicked streets of downtown Chicago. The wipers fought a losing battle against the downpour, blurring the streetlights into streaking neon lines. I balanced my laptop on my knees, my fingers flying across the keyboard. The decrypted master ledgers provided an undeniable roadmap of the embezzlement. I was isolating the specific wire transfers that proved Caroline and Jamal had siphoned capital meant for Vanguard's acquisition directly into their Cayman Island trusts. Sterling sat beside me, gripping his phone to his ear, arguing furiously with a federal judge. "Your Honor, I understand it is after hours," Sterling said, his voice straining to maintain professional courtesy over the roar of the car engine. "But the evidence submitted to your clerk clearly demonstrates active multi-million-dollar corporate fraud. If Vanguard Capital executes the merger agreement tonight, the liable assets will vanish across international borders. We need an immediate injunction." A tense silence filled the car as Sterling listened to the response. I held my breath, watching the progress bar on my document compilation hit 100%. I slammed the laptop shut and shoved it into my leather briefcase. "Yes, Your Honor, the sole voting shareholder of the holding company is present and willing to swear an affidavit." "Thank you." Sterling ended the call and let out a long, ragged exhale. "The judge is signing the order electronically. My paralegal is printing the physical mandate right now. We have to swing by the office to grab the hard copy, and then we head straight to the Ritz-Carlton." "We are running out of time," I said, checking my watch. The gala started 30 minutes ago. Caroline loves a grand spectacle. She will push for the formal signing ceremony early in the evening to secure the optics for the press. Sterling pressed down on the accelerator. We will make it. 20 minutes later, we pulled up to the imposing entrance of the Ritz-Carlton. The grand facade was illuminated by floodlights, and a line of black town cars idled near the valet stand. A red carpet stretched from the curb to the revolving glass doors flanked by velvet ropes, and a small army of private security contractors wearing earpieces and dark suits. Caroline was taking no chances. She had transformed a corporate gala into a fortress. I stepped out of the car. I wore a tailored charcoal gray suit, my hair pulled back into a severe twist. I carried myself not as a discarded daughter, but as the senior independent auditor preparing to execute a hostile takeover. Sterling walked a half step behind me, carrying the heavy legal portfolio containing the federal injunction stamped with the crimson seal of the United States District Court. We bypassed the valet line and marched directly toward the main entrance. As we approached the velvet ropes, two massive security guards stepped forward, blocking the path. Their posture was rigid, their expressions blank and unyielding. Invitations, please. The taller guard demanded, holding out a hand. This is a private, closed corporate event. No press, no unauthorized personnel. I do not need an invitation. I stated, my voice cutting through the ambient noise of the street. I am the primary shareholder of the holding company acquiring the subsidiary hosting this event. Step aside. The guard did not move. My orders come directly from Mrs. Davis. No one matching your description is allowed inside. If you do not step back, ma'am, we will forcefully remove you from the premises. 4 more guards materialized from the shadows, forming a solid wall of muscle between me and the glass doors. I could see the glittering chandeliers of the grand lobby through the glass. Wealthy guests mingled, sipping champagne, oblivious to the confrontation brewing just outside. I did not step back. I squared my shoulders, planting my feet firmly on the red carpet. You lay a hand on me, I said, my tone lethally calm, and you will spend the next 5 years defending yourself against assault and battery charges. The tension spiked. The guards exchanged a glance, preparing to physically engage. Suddenly, the heavy glass doors pushed open. Jamal Jackson strolled out onto the red carpet, a smug, victorious smile plastered across his face. He wore a tuxedo that probably cost more than my first car. He held a crystal tumbler of scotch, taking a slow, deliberate sip as he surveyed the scene. Well, well, Jamal chuckled, his voice dripping with condescension. The prodigal auditor returns. I must say, Harper, I admire your persistence. But your little crusade ends here. He stepped closer, standing safely behind the wall of guards. You really thought you could just waltz in here and ruin the biggest night of my career? You are nothing, Harper. You have no money. You have no influence. You are just a bitter, discarded piece of trash trying to scrape relevance from a family that threw you away. Now turn around and crawl back to whatever miserable apartment you hide in before I have these men throw you into the street. I did not yell. I did not hurl insults. I simply looked at him, feeling a deep, chilling sense of satisfaction. I had baited him into a public confrontation right in front of the glass doors, where the Vanguard executives inside could see the commotion. I am not here to argue with you, Jamal, I said softly. I turned my head slightly, gesturing to the man standing silently behind me. Sterling, if you please. Sterling Montgomery stepped forward, pulling a thick legal document from his portfolio. He held it up high, the stark white paper contrasting sharply against the dark suits of the guards. The crimson seal of the federal court glowed under the valet floodlights. This is an emergency federal injunction, Sterling announced, his voice carrying the booming authority of a seasoned litigator. Signed by a United States District Judge, effective immediately. It orders the immediate suspension of all merger activities, financial transfers, and executive actions by Davis Real Estate, LLC, pending an investigation into corporate fraud. The smug smile slid off Jamal's face, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. The glass tumbler slipped from his fingers, shattering against the pavement. Any individual attempting to block the delivery of a federal court order. Sterling continued, his gaze sweeping over the security team, "is committing a federal offense. You will be arrested for obstruction of justice." The guards froze. They were highly paid private contractors, but they were not fools. They recognized the Crimson Seal. They understood the legal consequences of obstructing a federal mandate. One by one, they lowered their arms and stepped backward, breaking the wall, parting like the Red Sea. Jamal stood exposed, his mouth opening and closing silently like a suffocating fish. He tried to muster a response, tried to salvage his crumbling authority, but the words failed him. The illusion of his power was shattered by a single piece of paper. I stepped forward, closing the distance until I was mere inches from his face. "You told me I had no right to step foot in here," I whispered, leaning in close so only he could hear. "But you forgot one crucial detail, Jamal. I own the building, I own the company, and as of tonight, I own you." I did not wait for a response. I brushed past him, my shoulder deliberately clipping his chest, knocking him off balance. I pushed open the heavy glass doors and stepped into the dazzling, chaotic brilliance of the Ritz-Carlton Grand Ballroom, ready to tear my family's empire to the ground. The double doors of the Ritz-Carlton Grand Ballroom swung open, yielding to my push. I stepped over the threshold, leaving the frantic security guards behind me. The sheer scale of the event unfolded before my eyes. 300 guests filled the room, a sea of bespoke tuxedos and designer gowns. Waiters navigated through the crowd, carrying silver trays of champagne. At the far end of the room, a raised stage was bathed in bright spotlight. The Davis Real Estate logo was projected onto a giant screen behind the podium. My mother stood at the microphone, holding a crystal flute high in the air. She wore a stunning emerald green evening gown, her hair styled in perfect cascading waves. She was delivering her victory speech, selling the lie of our family legacy to a room full of greedy investors. I walked down the center aisle. I did not rush. My heels clicked against the polished marble floor, a steady, rhythmic cadence that began to draw attention. The guests standing near the back turned around. Conversations halted. The silence spread like a contagion, moving from the rear of the ballroom toward the front. The string quartet, situated near the ice sculpture, faltered, the cellist losing his bow rhythm as he stared at me. Caroline noticed the shift in the room. She paused mid-sentence, her smile freezing as her gaze tracked the turning heads. When her eyes finally locked onto mine, the blood drained from her face, leaving her skin an ashen gray. The champagne flute trembled in her grip, spilling a few drops of pale liquid onto her emerald dress. She slammed the glass down on the podium and descended the stage stairs with uncharacteristic haste. She marched down the aisle to intercept me, her heels digging into the carpet. She closed the distance, grabbing my forearm with a grip so tight her manicured nails dug into my skin. "What are you doing here?" Caroline hissed through clenched teeth, her voice a toxic whisper meant only for my ears. "You are a disgrace. If you ruin tonight, I swear to God I will kill you myself." I looked down at her hand, gripping my wrist, then back up to her panicked eyes. "You already tried to ruin my life 10 years ago," I replied, my tone devoid of any emotion. "You have nothing left to threaten me with." I shoved her hand away. The physical dismissal threw her off balance. She stumbled backward, her emerald gown twisting awkwardly around her legs. I stepped past her, walking straight up the velvet steps and onto the stage. A low murmur erupted across the ballroom. 300 members of the Chicago financial elite whispered to one another, sensing the impending disaster. I walked to the podium, grabbed the microphone, and looked out over the crowd. Standing in the front row was Harrison Cole, the senior managing partner of Vanguard Capital. He was a ruthless corporate raider known for dismantling heritage companies. He looked furious. He stepped forward, adjusting his tie, his face flushed with indignation. "Who are you?" Harrison demanded, his voice echoing across the quiet room. Security was supposed to clear the perimeter. "We are minutes away from executing a $50 million acquisition. Explain this interruption immediately." I looked down at the billionaire. "I am Harper Davis," I stated clearly into the microphone, "and I am here to save you from throwing $50 million into a federal crime scene." Harrison narrowed his eyes, crossing his arms over his chest. I signaled to Sterling Montgomery, who was standing near the audiovisual booth at the side of the stage. He handed a decrypted flash drive to the sound technician, flashing the red-sealed federal court order to ensure compliance. The technician quickly plugged the drive into the main console. The giant screen behind me flickered. The Davis Real Estate logo vanished. In its place, a high-resolution scan of the Delaware Holding Company charter illuminated the ballroom. "Please direct your attention to the screen," I announced. "What you see is the true corporate structure of the Davis empire. Davis Real Estate is merely a subsidiary. The entity holds no legal authority to liquidate its own portfolio. The overarching ownership belongs to a blind holding company. And as you can see on the final page of the charter, I am the sole voting shareholder." I paused, letting the reality sink into the minds of the seasoned investors in the room. I locked eyes with Harrison Cole. "Caroline and Jamal Jackson do not have the legal clearance to sell this company," I declared, my voice ringing with finality. "This merger is officially canceled." The ballroom erupted. Shouts of disbelief and anger echoed from the tables. Investors pulled out their phones, frantically dialing their legal departments. The carefully constructed facade of the Davis family had just been obliterated in front of the entire Chicago elite. A piercing screech cut through the noise. My younger sister Chloe charged down the center aisle, her face contorted in rage. She hiked up the skirt of her designer dress, sprinting up the stage stairs. She lunged toward me, raising her hand to slap my face. "You ruined my trust fund," she screamed. Before she could make contact, Sterling Montgomery stepped into her path. The seasoned lawyer caught her wrist in midair, holding her back with practiced ease. "Do not assault my client," Sterling warned her, his tone cold and professional. "Unless you wish to add criminal battery to your impending legal troubles." He shoved her back toward the edge of the stage. Chloe stumbled, bursting into humiliated tears. Just then, the heavy double doors at the back of the ballroom banged open. Jamal stormed inside, pushing past the confused guests. He was breathing heavily, his tuxedo jacket unbuttoned. He marched toward the stage, clutching a thick stack of papers in his hand. He was trying to salvage his burning ship. "Do not listen to a word she says," Jamal shouted, pointing a finger at me. He turned to Harrison Cole, adopting a desperate, pleading tone. "Harrison, this woman is estranged from the family. She is currently under investigation for elder abuse and fraud. We secured a court injunction against her just yesterday. She hacked our servers and forged those documents on the screen to extort us." Jamal climbed onto the stage, waving his fabricated injunction in the air. He faced the crowd, playing the role of the victimized executive. She locked her own grandmother in a room and manipulated her finances. She is a rogue actor. We have the paperwork ready to sign. We can proceed with the acquisition. I stood my ground, watching him spin his web of lies. "Jamal," I said, leaning into the microphone so my voice drowned out his frantic shouting. "Your ex parte injunction was just overturned by a federal judge. And if you want to talk about fraud, we should discuss the $50 million severance liability clause you hid in the Vanguard contract, the clause designed to route the acquisition funds directly into your Cayman Island trust accounts, leaving Vanguard holding a hollowed-out shell company buried in tax debt." Jamal froze. The color drained from his lips. "You are insane," he stammered, his voice losing its persuasive edge. "There are no offshore accounts." Harrison Cole stepped closer to the stage, his expression dark and unreadable. He looked from Jamal to me, weighing the conflicting narratives. He was a man who relied on hard data, not family drama. Right on cue, a sharp notification tone echoed from Harrison Cole's suit pocket. He pulled out his smartphone. He stared at the screen, his brow furrowing deep in concentration. I knew exactly what he was looking at. While Jamal was busy trying to frame me in the ballroom, the whistleblower Marcus had sent an anonymous email directly to Vanguard Capital's compliance department. The email contained the unredacted master ledgers, highlighting every single offshore routing number and fraudulent property deed Jamal had orchestrated over the past 5 years. The compliance team had just forwarded the raw data to their boss. The silence in the room stretched thick and suffocating. 300 guests watched the billionaire process the information. Harrison Cole slowly lowered his phone. He looked up at Jamal. The gaze he leveled at my brother-in-law was colder than the Chicago winter. "You tried to use my capital to cover your embezzlement," Harrison stated, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "You tried to make Vanguard the bag holder for your federal crimes." Jamal took a step backward, shaking his head frantically. "Harrison, please, that data is fabricated. I can explain the routing sequences. It is a tax mitigation strategy." Harrison did not wait for the explanation. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out the thick, leather-bound acquisition contract. It was the $50 million agreement that would have saved the Davis family from ruin. Harrison gripped the binding with both hands. In one swift, deliberate motion, he tore the contract straight down the middle. The sound of the thick parchment ripping echoed loudly through the silent ballroom. He dropped the torn halves onto the floor at Jamal's feet. "We are done," Harrison announced. He turned to his associates in the front row. "Call our legal team. We are filing a lawsuit against Davis Real Estate for gross misrepresentation and attempted corporate fraud. Let us leave." The Vanguard executives turned in unison and marched out of the ballroom. The remaining guests followed suit, rushing toward the exits to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout. The grand gala had turned into a mass exodus. Jamal fell to his knees, staring blankly at the ripped contract on the floor. His career, his wealth, and his freedom were gone in an instant. I stepped away from the podium, watching the empire crumble. The destruction was complete. But the night was not over. The financial ruin was only the beginning, and the true psychological break was about to unfold. The mass exodus from the Ritz-Carlton ballroom left a hollow, echoing silence in its wake. Only moments ago, this room had been the epicenter of Chicago high society, buzzing with the promise of a $50 million acquisition. Now the tables stood abandoned. Half-empty champagne flutes littered the white linen cloths. The string quartet had vanished. At the center of the stage, Jamal Jackson remained on his knees. He stared at the torn pieces of the Vanguard contract, the reality of his impending federal indictment crushing the breath from his lungs. The master ledgers Marcus had leaked contained the exact offshore routing numbers Jamal had used to siphon corporate funds. The digital footprint was undeniable. He was looking at a decade behind bars. My mother Caroline had retreated to a corner near the ice sculpture, clutching her emerald gown. Her perfect facade had shattered entirely. As she watched the last wealthy investor march out the double doors, a raw, animalistic wail tore from her throat. She collapsed onto the polished marble floor, her manicured hands covering her face as she sobbed hysterically. She was not mourning the loss of family unity. She was mourning the loss of her country club memberships, her luxury vehicles, and her carefully curated social status. I watched them from the edge of the stage, my face a mask of stone. 10 years ago, they had thrown me out into the snow because I refused to lie for them. They had built this empire on deceit, and I was merely the architect of its demolition. I felt no pity, only a clinical, detached sense of justice. The shock in the room quickly curdled into vicious, primal self-preservation. Jamal scrambled to his feet. He turned toward his wife, Chloe, his eyes wild and desperate. The smooth, confident fund manager was gone, replaced by a cornered animal looking for a scapegoat. "This is your fault," Jamal spat, pointing a shaking finger at Chloe. "You and your greedy mother pushed me into those high-risk hedge funds. You demanded the lifestyle, the yachts, the designer clothes, the trips to Monaco. You drained the operating capital, and you forced me to cook the books to cover the deficits." Chloe recoiled as if she had been struck. "How dare you blame me?" she shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly across the empty ballroom. "You are the financial genius. You set up the Cayman accounts. You told us the audit trail was secure. You told us Vanguard would never look at the subsidiary liabilities. You promised me we were safe." Caroline scrambled up from the floor, her makeup smeared across her cheeks. She pointed an accusing finger at Jamal. "You arrogant fool. You promised me this merger was airtight. I gave you control of the board because I trusted your firm. And now Vanguard is going to sue us into oblivion. I will testify against you, Jamal. I will tell the federal prosecutors you manipulated the board without my knowledge." Jamal let out a harsh, manic laugh. Go ahead, Caroline. Try to play the innocent widow. The ledgers Marcus leaked show your signature on every single offshore transfer approval. You signed the wire authorizations to cover your shopping sprees while the company bled out. We are all going to federal prison, and I will make sure you are in the cell right next to mine. The ugly truth spilled out into the open, a toxic barrage of recriminations and betrayals. They tore at each other like feral dogs fighting over scraps. The loyalty they had always preached to me, the family unity they demanded I respect, was exposed as a shallow illusion. It evaporated the moment the money disappeared. I had seen enough. I turned to Sterling Montgomery. Let us go. There is nothing left here. I began walking toward the exit, my heels clicking sharply against the floor. I wanted to leave this miserable display behind me. I wanted to return to my quiet apartment, pour a glass of bourbon, and close this chapter of my life forever. Harper, wait. The voice was frantic, ragged with desperation. I stopped, turning slowly. Caroline was scrambling across the floor. The elegant matriarch of the Davis family, the woman who had ruled her social circle with an iron fist, was crawling toward me on her hands and knees. She reached out her fingers, grabbing the hem of my charcoal suit trousers. She clung to the fabric, her knuckles turning white. Harper, please, Caroline sobbed, looking up at me with wide, pleading eyes. Her face was a ruin of smeared mascara and terror. You cannot do this. We will lose everything. The house, the cars, the reputation. We will be ruined. I looked down at the woman who had birthed me. I felt the fabric of my trousers pulling taut against her frantic grip. You are the voting shareholder of the holding company, Caroline pleaded, her voice cracking. You hold the power. You can restructure the debt. You can negotiate with Vanguard. You can pump your own capital into the LLC to cover the deficit. You can save the company, Harper. Please, I am your mother. You are my blood. You have to save us. The silence that followed her plea was heavy and absolute. Even Jamal and Chloe had stopped their vicious arguing, turning to watch, hoping that some shred of familial guilt still lingered within me. I looked down at her hands gripping my suit. Then I looked into her eyes. I saw no remorse for what they had done. I saw no apology for stealing my grandmother's assets, or for freezing my accounts, or for sending fixers to intercept me at the airport. I saw only the naked, grasping desperation of a woman terrified of losing her wealth. I reached down and pried her fingers off my trousers one by one. I stepped back, severing the physical connection. You are not crying because you lost your daughter 10 years ago. Caroline, I said, my voice dropping to a quiet, lethal register. You are crying because you lost your money. Caroline froze. The truth of my words hit her with devastating precision. She opened her mouth to argue, to deny it, but no sound emerged. The mask had fallen away completely. You threw me out to protect a lie. I continued my gaze, sweeping over Caroline, Jamal, and Chloe. You spent a decade building an empire of fraud, and tonight you want me to clean up your mess. I am an auditor. I balance ledgers, and right now your account is deeply in the red. I turned away from them, adjusting my blazer. I took a step toward the door, but a new thought crystallized in my mind, a strategy that Vivian had likely anticipated when she structured the holding company. I could walk away and let them face the legal fallout alone, or I could ensure they paid back every cent they had stolen. I stopped and looked back over my shoulder. I will not let this company go bankrupt. I announced, the words echoing clearly across the ballroom. I will use the holding company assets to satisfy the Vanguard lawsuit and settle the debts with the IRS. I will bail out the LLC. Caroline gasped, a fresh wave of tears springing to her eyes. Oh, thank God. Harper, thank you. You are saving the family. I knew you would do the right thing. We will make you the CEO. We will share the profits. Jamal exhaled sharply, sagging against a nearby table. Chloe let out a squeal of relief, running over to hug her mother. They thought they had survived. They thought they had manipulated me one final time. But I am setting one condition, I said, raising my hand to cut off their premature celebration. My voice was colder than ice. And it is non-negotiable. The relief vanished from their faces, replaced by cautious dread. Tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, I stated, staring directly at Caroline. You, Richard, Chloe, and Jamal will host a live press conference. You will invite every major financial news outlet in Chicago. You will stand in front of the cameras and you will publicly confess to the embezzlement, the tax evasion, and the attempted fraud regarding Vivian's estate. And you will publicly apologize for slandering my name." Jamal's eyes widened in horror. "Are you insane? If we confess on live television, the federal prosecutors will have a recorded admission of guilt. We will be handing them the conviction on a silver platter. My career will be over. I will never work in finance again." "That is the price of the bailout, Jamal," I replied, my expression unyielding. "You stand before the cameras and own your crimes, or I walk out that door right now, lock the holding company assets, and let the IRS dismantle your lives piece by piece. The choice is yours." I did not wait for an answer. I turned my back on the wreckage of my family and walked out of the ballroom. I had given them an ultimatum. Tomorrow morning, they would face the cameras, but they had no idea that the public confession was only the setup for the final devastating blow. My ultimatum hung in the stifling air of the empty ballroom like an executioner's blade. The prospect of standing in front of the Chicago press corps and confessing to a decade of financial crimes was a death sentence for their social standing. But the alternative, facing federal indictments with no legal defense fund and a mountain of corporate debt, was an actual prison sentence. I stood by the double doors watching the panic rip through them. I gave them exactly 60 seconds to decide. "I am not doing it," Jamal roared, breaking the stunned silence. He paced frantically in a tight circle, running a hand over his sweating forehead. "A public confession guarantees disbarment from the financial regulatory authorities. My licenses will be revoked. The SEC will ban me from trading for life. I will lose my firm. I will lose everything. We fight this in court. We hire defense attorneys and bury the evidence in procedural motions." "With what money?" Jamal Richards snapped. My father had remained uncharacteristically quiet since my arrival, but the sheer gravity of the situation finally pierced his cowardice. He stepped forward, his face pale and drawn. "Vanguard is suing us. The IRS is going to freeze the LLC operating accounts by Monday. We cannot afford to pay the retaining fees for a single defense lawyer, let alone a team of litigators. Harper holds the master company. She controls the only clean capital left." Richard turned to his wife. "Caroline, if we go to trial, they will subpoena the offshore records. They will see my signature on the shell company formations. I am the CEO on paper. I will be the one facing 20 years in federal prison. We have to take Harper's deal. We take the public humiliation, let her bail out the company, and we avoid jail time." Caroline stared at my father with a mixture of disgust and raw terror. Her mind was calculating the variables, weighing the destruction of her pristine reputation against the prospect of wearing a prison uniform. Chloe grabbed Jamal's arm, her voice shrill and trembling. "Jamal, you have to do it. You promised me we were safe. If you do not confess, they will arrest me too. I am listed as a managing director on the Cayman Trusts. I cannot go to jail, Jamal. I cannot." Jamal violently shook her hand off his arm. "Shut up, Chloe." He snarled, his composure completely disintegrating. "This is a trap. Harper is an auditor. She does not offer mercy. If we confess on camera, we hand the federal prosecutors the smoking gun. We are admitting guilt before a grand jury is even convened. It is legal suicide." "Jamal, look at me." Caroline commanded, her voice dropping to a harsh, pragmatic register. She had made her calculation. The matriarch was prioritizing survival over pride. Caroline stepped into Jamal's personal space, forcing him to meet her gaze. "The Vanguard deal is dead. The money is gone. If Harper injects capital into the LLC, we can pay off the Vanguard lawsuit and settle the tax deficit quietly. The press conference will be a nightmare, yes. We will be social pariahs in Winnetka for a season, but we will not be behind bars. We keep our freedom. We let the scandal die down, and we rebuild quietly. We accept the terms." Jamal glared at her, his jaw tight with repressed rage. "You are trusting the daughter you exiled 10 years ago to save you. You are a fool, Caroline." "I do not trust her." Caroline shot back, her eyes flicking briefly toward me. "But she is a Davis. She cares about the family legacy even if she hates us. She will not let the company name go bankrupt." I listened to their pathetic rationalizations. They truly believed my demand for a public confession was driven by petty ego. They believed I simply wanted to humiliate them before swooping in to rescue the Davis real estate empire with the holding company funds. They thought one moment of televised groveling would buy their salvation. They were fundamentally incapable of understanding the depth of my grandmother's foresight. My phone vibrated in my pocket. I checked the screen. It was an automated alert from the federal court docket system. The Vanguard legal team had officially filed their notice of intent to sue. The clock was accelerating. "Time is up," I announced, my voice cutting through their desperate negotiations. "Do we have an agreement, or do I call the IRS Fraud Division directly and save the Vanguard attorneys the trouble of discovery?" Caroline straightened her posture, smoothing the front of her ruined emerald gown. She adopted a fragile, dignified expression, attempting to salvage a shred of authority. "We accept your terms, Harper," Caroline said, her voice tight but controlled. "Tomorrow morning at 9, the main conference room at the Davis corporate headquarters. We will release a statement to the press acknowledging our financial misjudgments and apologizing for the misunderstanding regarding your involvement. In exchange, you will initiate the capital transfer from the holding company to the LLC to cover the immediate liabilities." I nodded slowly, letting the silence stretch to enforce the severity of the moment. "I will see you at 9. I turned and walked out of the ballroom. Sterling Montgomery matching my stride. We moved through the opulent lobby of the Ritz-Carlton, past the bewildered hotel staff and the lingering whispers of the departing guests. The cold night air of Chicago hit my face as we stepped out onto the sidewalk. Sterling signaled for his driver. He turned to me, his brow furrowed in deep concern. Harper Sterling began, keeping his voice low. "I understand the desire for a public confession. It clears your name and provides immense leverage for the criminal proceedings. But injecting the holding company capital into the LLC to cover their embezzlement, Vivian did not leave you that money to bail out her abusers. If you transfer those funds, you are paying their debts. You are letting them escape the financial consequences of their actions." I stopped near the curb and looked at the seasoned attorney. A cold, sharp smile touched the corners of my mouth. "Sterling," I said quietly, "I am an auditor. I balance ledgers. I do not pay other people's debts." I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a single encrypted document I had extracted from the Delaware vault earlier that day. It was a restricted codicil attached to the Master Holding Company charter, drafted personally by Vivian and sealed under maximum security. I handed it to Sterling. "Read the structural reorganization clause I instructed." Sterling adjusted his glasses and examined the document under the glow of the street lamp. His eyes scanned the dense legal text. As he processed the information, his mouth fell open slightly. A look of profound realization washed over his face. "Good God," Sterling whispered, looking up at me with an expression of sheer awe. "She didn't." "She did," I confirmed. Vivian Davis had been sharp until her final breath. She knew her family was draining the operating capital. She knew Jamal was cooking the books. And she knew that one day the house of cards would collapse. So 3 years ago, she orchestrated a corporate maneuver so brilliant and so deeply concealed that neither Jamal's accountants nor Vanguard's acquisition team had detected it during due diligence. She restructured the liability pipeline. My family thought they were running an empire. They thought they were accepting a humiliating public confession in exchange for a multi-million-dollar bailout. Tomorrow morning, in front of the entire Chicago press corps, they were going to find out that the bailout was an illusion, and the trap they had just agreed to step into was permanent, irreversible, and entirely of their own making. I got into the waiting car. The final audit was scheduled for 9 a.m. The morning sky over Chicago hung low and gray, matching the grim atmosphere inside the Davis corporate headquarters. I arrived at the Executive Conference Center at exactly 8:45. The room was already packed. News vans idled outside the building, and inside reporters from the Chicago Tribune, Crane's Chicago Business, and several local television affiliates jostled for position. Tripods were set camera lenses focused tightly on the raised dais at the front of the room. My family sat behind a long, polished oak table. They looked like prisoners awaiting sentencing. Richard stared blankly at his folded hands. Chloe chewed nervously on her lower lip, hiding behind oversized sunglasses. Jamal sat rigidly, his jaw clenched so tightly, a muscle ticked visibly in his cheek. He glared at the reporters, radiating a hostile, cornered energy. Caroline sat in the center. She wore a modest charcoal gray dress, a calculated departure from her usual ostentatious wardrobe. She had spent decades cultivating relationships with the city's elite, hosting charity galas and appearing in society pages. This press conference was the public execution of her carefully constructed identity. I took a seat in the front row directly in their line of sight. I wore a sharp navy blazer, my posture relaxed. I placed my phone on the table in front of me. At exactly 9 o'clock, Richard leaned toward the microphone. His hands trembled as he unfolded a prepared statement. "We have called this press conference today to address the sudden cancellation of the Vanguard Capital merger." Richard began, his voice lacking any of its usual booming authority. "Following an internal review, we must disclose that significant financial discrepancies were identified within the operational ledgers of Davis Real Estate, LLC. He swallowed hard, refusing to look at the cameras. For the past 5 years, certain executive decisions led to the misappropriation of corporate funds. We engaged in high-risk investments that resulted in substantial hidden deficits. Furthermore, we acknowledge that my daughter Harper Davis was unjustly estranged from this family a decade ago, after she identified early signs of these financial irregularities. We apologize for damaging her professional and personal reputation." The reporters erupted, shouting questions over one another. "Mr. Davis, are you admitting to corporate fraud? Is the SEC investigating your firm? Where is the $50 million from the Vanguard deal?" Jamal leaned into his microphone, raising a hand to quiet the room. His voice was smooth, attempting to regain control of the narrative. "We are fully cooperating with all regulatory authorities to resolve these tax discrepancies. We are restructuring our assets to ensure full compliance moving forward. We ask for privacy during this transitional period." It was a sanitized corporate non-apology. They were trying to spin federal embezzlement into a simple accounting error, but Caroline was not satisfied with playing the role of the disgraced executive. She was a narcissist who could not tolerate bearing the blame alone. She needed to drag someone down with her. As the reporters continued to press for details, she grabbed the microphone from Richard. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling over her carefully applied makeup. She looked directly into the primary television camera, her voice trembling with manufactured grief. "We made terrible mistakes," Caroline sobbed, pressing a tissue to her cheek. "But you must understand the pressure we were under. My husband was trying to save this family's legacy. And yes, we wronged Harper. But what you do not know is that Harper orchestrated this public humiliation." The reporters fell silent, sensing a sudden shift in the story. Pens hovered over notepads. Caroline pointed a trembling finger at me sitting in the front row. "She holds the controlling shares of the holding company. She has the capital to save this business, to save our employees' jobs. But she refused to help unless we stood up here and destroyed our lives on television. She is holding the company hostage. Harper has always been a cold, vindictive child. She is not here for justice. She is here for revenge." The atmosphere in the room pivoted instantly. Whispers rippled through the press corps. Cameras swiveled away from the dais, focusing their lenses on me. Caroline had executed a brilliant, desperate counterattack. She was weaponizing her vulnerability, attempting to reframe the narrative. She wanted the headline to read about a ruthless, estranged daughter destroying her grieving family, rather than a cabal of corrupt executives facing federal charges. Jamal smirked, a brief flash of triumph crossing his face. He thought Caroline had successfully muddied the waters. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to defend myself. I slowly stood up, smoothing the lapels of my blazer. The room watched in hushed anticipation as I walked toward the dais. I bypassed the cluster of reporters and stepped up to the podium, standing just feet away from my mother. Caroline glared at me, her fake tears drying up as she braced for an argument. "You think I am cold, Caroline?" I asked, my voice carrying clearly through the room without a microphone. "You think this is an act of vindictive revenge?" I pulled my smartphone from my pocket. I reached over to the main audio console resting on the edge of the dais and plugged a standard auxiliary cable into the headphone jack of my device. "Let us provide the press with some context regarding this family's grief," I announced. I tapped the screen of my phone. The audio file I had recorded 2 nights prior, the live feed transmitted from the microbug I planted in Richard's golf bag, echoed through the massive high-definition speakers of the conference hall. The recording started with the unmistakable clink of crystal glasses, the ambient noise of the Winnetka estate study. Then Caroline's voice filled the room. It was not the weeping, fragile tone she had just used for the cameras. It was sharp, vicious, and dripping with venom. "The old bat died right on schedule," Caroline's recorded voice sneered. "I am exhausted from pretending to care about her lectures. She dragged this out for years." A collective gasp echoed through the press corps. Several reporters lowered their cameras, staring at the speakers in shock. Caroline froze on the dais, her mouth opening in silent horror. Richard buried his face in his hands. The recording continued. Jamal's smooth, arrogant voice joined the conversation. "We execute the Vanguard merger by Friday." Jamal's voice boasted through the speakers. "The 50 million hits the LLC. We route 80% through the Cayman Shell accounts to cover my margin calls and clear your personal tax liens. Vanguard gets stuck with the debt, and we are on a private jet to St. Bart's before the SEC even opens a file. Richard takes the fall if anyone asks questions. He is too stupid to realize he is the liability shield." Caroline laughed on the recording. "Just get the money moved, Jamal. I want this miserable chapter closed." I hit pause on my phone. The silence in the conference room was absolute heavy with the weight of undeniable recorded malice. The reporters were no longer whispering. They were frantically typing, realizing they had just captured a definitive criminal confession on tape. The narrative was no longer about a vindictive daughter. It was about a calculated sociopathic conspiracy to defraud investors and abandon a patriarch to federal prison. Chloe burst into loud, ugly sobs, hiding her face in her arms. Jamal looked physically ill, his eyes darting frantically toward the exits as if calculating his chances of escaping the building before the authorities arrived. He knew that recording, combined with the unredacted ledgers I held, guaranteed his conviction. Caroline sat paralyzed. The mask was not just off. It had been pulverized in front of the entire city. She stared at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. I unplugged my phone and slipped it back into my pocket. I leaned closer to my mother, ensuring the microphones picked up every word. "I did not force you to confess today because I am vindictive." "Caroline," I stated, my voice echoing coldly across the room, "I forced you to confess because I needed your guilt established on the public record before I execute the final audit." I turned away from the dais and faced the reporters. I signaled to Sterling Montgomery, who stepped forward from the back of the room, carrying a stack of thick legal dossiers. He began distributing the packets to the front row of journalists. "Ladies and gentlemen of the press," I announced. "The individuals sitting behind me believe they have paid the price for their crimes today. They believe that their public humiliation was a transaction in exchange for my financial bailout of their bankrupt company." I looked back at Jamal, whose panicked expression suddenly morphed into deep, primal confusion. "They are incorrect," I concluded. I walked back to the center of the room. It was time to deploy Vivian's masterpiece, the corporate trap that would ensure they left this building with absolutely nothing. The impact of the audio recording hit the room like a physical shockwave. The reporters, seasoned veterans of Chicago's cynical political and corporate scandals, stood frozen. The sheer, unvarnished cruelty captured on that tape was staggering. It wasn't just white-collar crime. It was a profound sociopathic lack of human decency, broadcast directly into the microphones of every major news outlet in the city. The clinking of crystal glasses echoed through the speakers, a haunting reminder of their macabre celebration on the very night Vivian Davis had died. "The old bat died right on schedule." Caroline's recorded voice sneered the words, dripping with contempt. "I am exhausted from pretending to care about her lectures. She dragged this out for years. Prepare to divide the cash." Then Jamal's voice joined the audio feed, arrogant and assured. "Perfect timing. My tax liabilities will be wiped clean by morning." The recording laid bare the grotesque reality of the Davis family. They were not grieving relatives pushed into a corner by financial desperation, as Caroline had so tearfully claimed moments ago. They were predators waiting impatiently for a matriarch to die so they could feast on her estate. Camera flashes erupted in a blinding stroboscopic barrage illuminating the dais. Reporters shouted questions, the volume in the room escalating to a deafening roar. "Mrs. Davis, how do you respond to that recording?" "Mr. Jackson, are you admitting to premeditated tax fraud?" Caroline sat rigid, her face drained of all color. The fragile, victimized facade she had attempted to construct was pulverized. The mask was completely gone, leaving only the terrified expression of a woman realizing her social execution was being broadcast live across the nation. She opened her mouth, closing it again, searching for a lie that could save her. There were none left. Chloe collapsed forward, burying her face in her arms on the polished oak table, her shoulders heaving with loud, jagged sobs. The humiliation of her husband and mother's callousness being exposed so publicly broke her completely. Jamal, realizing the magnitude of the disaster, bolted from his chair. He shoved past Richard, knocking his father-in-law's shoulder, and lunged toward the side exit of the conference room. He was attempting to flee before the inevitable arrival of federal authorities. He didn't make it 3 steps. 2 massive security guards, the very men Caroline had hired to secure the building, stepped into Jamal's path. They crossed their arms, blocking the doorway. They were highly paid private contractors, but they recognized a sinking ship when they saw one. They weren't about to assist a fleeing felon on live television. "Step aside," Jamal demanded, his voice cracking with panic. The guards didn't move an inch. I disconnected the auxiliary cable from my phone and slipped the device back into my pocket. I turned away from the dais and faced the barrage of flashing cameras. The reporters shoved microphones in my direction, desperate for a soundbite. "I am not forcing a confession out of them today," I stated, staring directly into the lens of the primary news camera. My voice was calm, cutting through the chaos. "I am simply cleaning up the garbage they refer to as a family legacy." The room buzzed with chaotic energy reporters frantically typing updates on their phones, calling their editors to break the story. Caroline, realizing escape was impossible, slumped back in her chair, staring blankly ahead. Richard remained motionless, seemingly paralyzed by the reality of his impending ruin. But my work was not finished. The public humiliation, the destruction of their reputations, the exposure of their crimes, that was merely the necessary prelude. They still believed deep down that they had bought their salvation. They believed that enduring this press conference meant I would now unlock the holding company funds and bail them out of their catastrophic debt. They thought they were walking away penniless but free. They were wrong. I raised a hand, signaling for quiet. The room slowly settled down, the reporters recognizing that the climax of the press conference had not yet been reached. Sterling Montgomery stepped up beside me. He began distributing a second set of documents to the press corps. These were not financial ledgers or offshore routing numbers. These were copies of legal filings, stamped with the official seal of the Delaware Chancery Court. "You all heard the terms of our agreement," I said, addressing the room, but keeping my eyes fixed on Caroline. "They confessed to their crimes. In exchange, I agreed to use my authority over the master holding company to resolve the financial crisis plaguing Davis Real Estate, LLC. Caroline's head snapped up. A flicker of desperate hope ignited in her eyes. Despite the devastation of the audio recording, she still clung to the belief that the bailout was coming. She thought I was bound by my word to save them from bankruptcy and federal prosecution. I turned fully toward the dais, locking eyes with my mother. "I am a woman of my word, Caroline," I said, my voice echoing clearly across the silent room. "Yesterday evening I executed my executive authority as the sole voting shareholder of the holding company. I initiated the transfer of the entire liquid asset portfolio, $80 million in clean, untainted capital." Jamal stopped struggling against the security guards. He turned his head, his eyes widening. $80 million was more than enough to cover the Vanguard lawsuit, settle the IRS debts, and leave a substantial surplus. He let out a shaky breath, assuming the nightmare was over. But I didn't transfer the funds to the LLC. I continued, my tone dropping to a lethal quiet register. The fragile hope on the dais vanished instantly. I transferred the entire $80 million into an irrevocable philanthropic trust, I announced. The funds are legally locked. They will be distributed over the next 20 years to support victims of financial abuse and corporate fraud. The holding company accounts are now completely empty. Caroline sprang to her feet, her chair clattering backward onto the floor. "You transferred the money," she shrieked, her voice cracking with sheer hysteria. "You gave away $80 million. What about the company? What about the debt you promised to save the business?" I smiled, a cold, sharp expression that offered absolutely no comfort. "I promised to use my authority to resolve the crisis," I corrected her. "And I did. I protected Vivian's legacy from being used to pay your criminal debts." I gestured to the documents Sterling had just distributed to the press. What my family failed to realize during their decade of embezzlement, I explained to the room, is that Vivian Davis restructured the corporate hierarchy 3 years ago. The holding company I control only possessed the clean assets. The subsidiary they manage, Davis Real Estate, LLC, was deliberately isolated. I looked directly at Jamal, watching the horrific realization dawn on his face. The LLC currently holds $45 million in toxic, non-dischargeable debt, I stated, listing the liabilities with the precision of an auditor. The Vanguard lawsuit, the IRS penalties, the margin calls. It is all legally bound to the subsidiary, and as the registered directors of that subsidiary, you are personally liable for every single cent. Jamal's knees buckled. He grabbed the edge of a table to keep from collapsing onto the floor. He understood corporate law better than anyone in the room. Non-dischargeable debt meant they couldn't simply declare bankruptcy and walk away. The IRS and the federal courts would seize everything they owned, their houses, their cars, their personal bank accounts, and they would still be millions of dollars in the hole. "You didn't just expose them," a reporter from the Tribune shouted, reading through the documents. "You bankrupted them." "No," I replied, my voice steady and unyielding. "They bankrupted themselves. I just handed them the bill." The trap was sprung. The devastation was absolute. Vivian Davis had engineered the ultimate retribution from beyond the grave, and I had delivered it flawlessly. But the fallout of this financial annihilation was about to reshape their reality in ways they had never imagined. The reality of the $45 million non-dischargeable debt hung over the dais like a guillotine. The reporters in the room, seasoned professionals accustomed to corporate spin, stared at the legal documents in their hands with wide eyes. They were witnessing the total, irreversible annihilation of one of Chicago's most prominent real estate families, executed with chilling precision. Jamal Jackson, the brilliant fund manager who had spent years manipulating the Davis portfolio, slowly sank to his knees. The fight completely left his body. His hands gripped the edge of the dais, his knuckles white, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. He understood the intricacies of Delaware corporate law. He knew that the corporate veil, the legal shield that typically protected executives from a company's liabilities, had been expertly pierced by Vivian's restructuring. Because the debt stemmed from active fraud and tax evasion, the IRS would hold the registered directors personally accountable. They would strip him of his licenses, seize his assets, and send him to federal prison. He had spent a decade building a golden cage, and Vivian had just locked the door and thrown away the key. Caroline's reaction was entirely different. She refused to accept the finality of the situation. Her mind, warped by years of entitlement and control, frantically searched for a loophole, a way to bully her way out of the consequence. "You cannot do this!" Caroline shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly across the cavernous room. She pointed a trembling finger at Sterling Montgomery. "That restructuring is illegal. A holding company cannot simply dump its toxic liabilities onto a subsidiary and walk away with the clean capital. That is a fraudulent transfer. We will sue you. We will sue the estate. I will tie this up in probate court for 20 years. Sterling stepped forward, adjusting his glasses. He looked at Caroline with the calm, detached pity reserved for a cornered opponent making baseless threats. "You are welcome to challenge the restructuring," Caroline Sterling replied, his voice carrying clearly over the murmuring press corps. but you will find the paperwork immaculate. Vivian Davis executed the transfer 3 years ago, well before any of your fraudulent activities triggered federal scrutiny. The statute of limitations for challenging the corporate restructure expired 12 months ago. Furthermore, the transfer was fully compliant with Delaware law as the holding company adequately capitalized the subsidiary at the time of the split. It was your subsequent mismanagement, your offshore diversions, and your massive tax evasion that generated the $45 million deficit. The liability is yours. Entirely yours. Caroline opened her mouth to argue, but the words withered on her tongue. The legal reality crashed down on her. She had no defense. She had no capital to hire a defense team. She was staring at financial ruin. The physical toll of the revelation overwhelmed her. Her eyes rolled back and her knees buckled. She collapsed sideways, hitting the polished marble stage with a dull thud. She lay there motionless, her emerald gown pooled around her. Not a single person moved to assist her. Richard remained seated at the table, his gaze fixed on the empty space in front of him. He looked like an empty shell, a man who had finally realized the depth of his own cowardice. He had spent his life nodding along, signing documents without reading them, playing the loyal husband, while Caroline and Jamal hollowed out the empire. Now he was going down with the ship, the titular CEO, holding the bag for crimes he was too weak to stop. Chloe sat frozen, her hands covering her mouth, her eyes wide with terror. She looked at her unconscious mother, then at her husband groveling on the floor. She had lived a life of uninterrupted luxury, insulated from consequence. The concept of losing her penthouses, her designer clothes, her social standing, it was a reality she could not comprehend. The room erupted into a frenzy of activity. Reporters shouted questions, camera flashes strobed continuously, and the live broadcast feeds captured every agonizing detail of the family's collapse. I stood amidst the chaos, my posture perfectly rigid, my face betraying zero emotion. I had just orchestrated the destruction of the people who shared my DNA. I watched the frantic scrambling, the sheer desperation emanating from the dais, and I felt nothing. The anger, the resentment, the longing for their approval, it had all burned away years ago, leaving only this cold, calculating clarity. I turned away from the stage. My work here was done. As I began walking toward the exit, a reporter from the Wall Street Journal thrust a microphone into my path. "Ms. Davis, a quick question," the reporter shouted over the din. "You just gave away $80 million and bankrupted your own family. What is your next move? Are you taking over the remnants of the company?" I paused, looking directly into the camera lens. I kept my expression neutral, my tone clinical. "I am an independent auditor," I stated simply. "I identify structural weaknesses, I expose financial liabilities, and I balance the ledgers. The Davis family ledger is now balanced. I have no interest in salvaging the remnants of their subsidiary. They can handle the IRS on their own." I bypassed the reporter and continued toward the heavy double doors at the back of the conference hall. Sterling Montgomery flanked me, his presence a silent barrier against further inquiries. We pushed through the doors and stepped out into the crisp Chicago morning air. The gray clouds overhead were beginning to break, letting thin shafts of sunlight filter through the city skyline. We stood on the sidewalk waiting for Sterling's driver to pull the car around. The muted roar of the press conference still echoed from inside the building, a distant reminder of the carnage I had left behind. Sterling turned to me, offering a rare, genuine smile. "Your grandmother would be incredibly proud of you, Harper," he said quietly. "She knew this day would come. She knew you were the only one with the strength to execute her plan." I looked down the busy street, watching the commuters hurry past, oblivious to the corporate execution that had just taken place inside the glass tower. "She gave me the weapon," I replied, "but she also gave me the freedom to walk away. I am not carrying their debt anymore." The black sedan pulled up to the curb. I opened the door, but before I could step inside, my burner phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, checking the screen. It was a message from an encrypted number. "The Vanguard executives are livid. They are pressing for immediate criminal charges regarding the fraudulent merger documents. The FBI just arrived at Jamal's office. The final piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. The legal machinery was in motion, and it would not stop until the Davis family was stripped bare. But as I slid into the back seat of the car, I realized that the true aftermath of this destruction was just beginning. The empire was gone, but the individuals remained, and their desperation was about to take a far more dangerous turn. The chaos inside the Davis corporate headquarters did not remain contained within the walls of the press room. By noon, the shockwaves of the botched Vanguard merger and the public confession had triggered a catastrophic chain reaction across Chicago's financial sector. I monitored the fallout from the quiet sanctuary of my apartment, my laptop screen, a mosaic of breaking news alerts and fluctuating stock tickers. The reality of Vivian's masterstroke played out exactly as the legal documents dictated. Under Delaware corporate law, piercing the corporate veil is notoriously difficult, designed to protect executives from personal liability for business debts. However, there are explicit exceptions. When a corporate entity is utilized to perpetrate active fraud, embezzle funds, or evade federal taxes, the legal shield dissolves. Vivian had not just isolated the clean capital. She had meticulously documented the timeline of Jamal and Caroline's illicit activities, linking their personal signatures to the creation of the toxic debt. They had believed they were inheriting an untouchable empire. Instead, they had willingly signed the operational directives for a doomed subsidiary holding $45 million in non-dischargeable liabilities. Non-dischargeable meant that even if they filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy, the federal government would not erase the debt. The IRS would seize their primary residences, their investment portfolios, and garnish any future earnings until the balance was settled or they died. It was a financial death sentence. The first domino fell shortly after 1 o'clock. A news alert chimed on my monitor. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, acting in coordination with the Securities and Exchange Commission, had raided Jamal's private wealth management firm in the Loop. Agents carried out boxes of hard drives and physical files. Vanguard Capital's aggressive legal team had wasted no time submitting the unredacted ledgers I exposed, providing the federal prosecutors with a frictionless path to indictment. Jamal's career was vaporized in an afternoon. An hour later, the internal dynamics of the Davis family fractured completely under the mounting pressure. My secure burner phone, the one number I had left unblocked for monitoring purposes, began buzzing relentlessly. I ignored the first 3 calls, assuming they were frantic pleas from Caroline or empty threats from Richard. But when a text message arrived from an unknown number containing a single desperate plea for help, I opened the encrypted messaging app. It was Chloe. "Harper, please. They are freezing everything. The bank rejected my debit card at the grocery store. Jamal left the house and will not answer his phone. Mom is locked in her bedroom screaming at her lawyers. I do not know what to do. You have to help me." I read the message feeling a profound sense of detachment. My younger sister, who had spent her entire life insulated by wealth, parading her designer clothes, and mocking my modest lifestyle, was experiencing the cold reality of consequence for the very first time. She had happily signed the documents listing her as a managing director on the Cayman Trusts, eager to collect the illicit dividends without ever questioning the source. Now she was realizing that her signature bound her to the incoming federal indictments. I did not reply. I deleted the message and blocked the number. I was an auditor, not a savior. The true scale of their ruin materialized the following morning. I woke early, poured a cup of black coffee, and turned on the local news. The lead story featured aerial footage of the Winnetka estate, the sprawling mansion where I had endured 18 years of emotional starvation. Several sleek black government vehicles were parked in the circular driveway. Agents in windbreakers emblazoned with IRS criminal investigation were walking out the front doors carrying artwork, electronics, and sealed boxes. The federal government was executing immediate asset seizures based on the undeniable evidence of multi-million-dollar tax evasion. The camera zoomed in on a figure standing on the manicured lawn. It was my father, Richard Davis, The man who had ordered security to throw me out of his home stood shivering in his bathrobe, watching federal agents dismantle his life. His shoulders were slumped, his posture defeated. He looked entirely broken, a hollow shell of the domineering patriarch he had pretended to be. He had spent his life avoiding conflict, hiding behind my mother's ambition, and now he was bearing the full brunt of the devastation alone. There was no sign of Caroline. She had likely fled to a hotel or sought refuge with one of her high society friends, desperately trying to salvage whatever social capital remained before the indictments were officially unsealed. But the Chicago elite is a pragmatic, ruthless circle. They do not associate with radioactive assets. Caroline would find closed doors and unreturned phone calls wherever she went. I turned off the television. The spectacle was over. The Davis real estate empire was gone, replaced by a smoking crater of federal investigations and bankruptcy filings. The toxic family dynamic that had defined my existence had been surgically excised, leaving behind nothing but the stark, undeniable truth. I walked over to my desk and picked up the heavy leather-bound biometric ledger, the device that had secured the crucial evidence. I ran my fingers over the hidden compartment where the scanner resided. I no longer needed it. The data was backed up on secure servers already in the hands of federal prosecutors. I placed the ledger into a heavy-duty shredding bin. My phone rang. This time it was my primary line. I checked the caller ID and answered. Harper Sterling Montgomery's voice came through, sounding remarkably upbeat. I just received confirmation from the Delaware Chancery Court. The transfer of the $80 million to the Philanthropic Trust has been fully executed and verified. The funds are secure, and the holding company is officially dissolved. Excellent, I replied, staring out my window at the Chicago skyline, and the subsidiary Sterling let out a dry chuckle. The IRS filed a priority lien against Davis Real Estate, LLC, this morning. The company accounts are frozen solid. Vanguard Capital dropped their lawsuit regarding the botched acquisition, but they filed a separate civil claim against Jamal and Richard personally for fraudulent misrepresentation during the negotiation phase. They are going to squeeze blood from a stone. It is their problem now, I said. Thank you for your counsel, Sterling. The pleasure was entirely mine, Harper. Vivian chose her successor well. I ended the call and set the phone down. The silence in my apartment was profound, lacking the underlying hum of anxiety that had defined my life for a decade. The constant anticipation of the next attack, the next manipulation, the next attempt to drag me back into their toxic orbit, it was all gone. I had executed the final audit. I had balanced the ledger. The Davis family had paid their debts in full. But as I stood alone in the quiet apartment, a new realization settled over me. The war was over, but the quiet aftermath required a different kind of strength. I had spent my life defining myself in opposition to them. Now, with their shadow permanently removed, I had to figure out who I was in the light. The television mounted on the wall of my corner office displayed the midday broadcast from a local news affiliate. A reporter stood on the concrete steps outside the Dirksen Federal Courthouse, clutching a microphone against the harsh Chicago wind. The headlines scrolling across the bottom third of the screen confirmed the end of a long, arduous legal battle. Former investment manager sentenced in federal tax fraud scheme. I turned up the volume using the remote on my desk. The broadcast cut to footage of Jamal Jackson exiting the courthouse doors. The arrogant, bespoke aesthetic he once weaponized against his peers was entirely gone. He wore a standard-issue khaki jumpsuit, his wrists bound by heavy steel cuffs linked to a waist chain. Federal marshals flanked him on either side, guiding him toward a waiting armored transport vehicle. The reporter detailed the swift and merciless ruling handed down by the federal judge. Jamal had been sentenced to 60 months in a maximum security penitentiary with no possibility of early parole. The prosecution utilized the unredacted ledgers and the damning audio recording to dismantle his defense strategy within the first week of the trial. The judge ordered the immediate forfeiture of his remaining offshore accounts, permanently revoked his trading licenses, and banned him from holding any fiduciary position for the rest of his natural life. The man who tried to leverage my family into an early retirement was now a convicted felon, stripped of his wealth and his freedom. The broadcast transitioned to a secondary segment outlining the collapse of the Davis real estate subsidiary. B-roll footage captured the Grand Winnetka estate, the property where I had spent 18 years enduring my mother's psychological warfare. A bright yellow bank foreclosure notice was plastered across the heavy oak front doors. The sprawling manicured lawn had grown wild and overgrown, littered with dead leaves. The Internal Revenue Service had executed a series of relentless asset seizures to satisfy the $45 million non-dischargeable debt my parents had willingly signed for. Federal agents confiscated Caroline's luxury vehicles, her jewelry collections, and the contents of the wine cellar they had raided on the night of my grandmother's death. Richard and Caroline were evicted from the North Shore. Stripped of their credit and their capital, they were forced to rent a cramped two-bedroom apartment in a decaying industrial suburb far outside the city limits. I pictured my mother navigating a narrow galley kitchen with peeling linoleum floors, surrounded by the cheap particle board furniture she used to openly mock. Her social execution was comprehensive. The elite circles of Chicago operate on a strict, unforgiving currency of wealth and reputation. The moment the federal indictments became public record, Caroline's country club associates erased her from their directories. She was a pariah isolated in a concrete box, left alone with the husband she despised. The financial annihilation spared no one who had attached their signature to those fraudulent offshore trusts. Chloe had spent her entire adult life playing the role of the spoiled heiress, funding her extravagant lifestyle through the illicit dividends Jamal generated. When the government froze those accounts, her reality fractured. She attempted to maintain the illusion of wealth for a few weeks, posting archived photographs of yacht trips and designer boutiques on her social media platforms. But the facade crumbled when repo men towed her luxury SUV away in the middle of the night. The digital influencer vanished overnight. Her curated profiles were deleted to hide from the barrage of public mockery. Through a mutual acquaintance in the corporate accounting sector, I learned the harsh truth of her new existence. Chloe was now working as a cashier at a discount grocery chain in the outer suburbs. She spent her days scanning barcodes under harsh, unforgiving fluorescent lights, bagging canned goods for minimum wage. The insulation of endless wealth was stripped away, leaving her exposed to the relentless, exhausting grind of the working class she had always considered beneath her. I muted the television and turned my attention back to the spreadsheet illuminated on my primary monitor. My independent auditing firm occupied a pristine, sunlit suite on the 30th floor of a sleek glass tower in the Loop. Polished concrete floors and minimalist steel furniture reflected my own uncompromising standard of clarity. Business was thriving beyond my initial projections. The public exposure of the Davis family fraud had inadvertently served as a highly effective advertisement for my analytical skills. Corporate boards across the Midwest hired my team to conduct hostile internal audits, knowing I possessed the clinical detachment required to uncover the most deeply buried financial corruption. I built a formidable roster of clients who valued hard, undeniable truth over comfortable optics. Resting on the corner of my mahogany desk, housed in a simple silver frame, was a photograph of my grandmother. Vivian Davis looked back at me through the glass, her silver hair pulled back tightly, her eyes sharp and assessing. She had meticulously engineered the corporate trap from her deathbed, but she had trusted me to spring it. The $80 million in the philanthropic trust was already active funding elite legal defense teams for vulnerable victims of financial abuse and corporate fraud. We had balanced the ledger, honoring her legacy by dismantling the very greed that had poisoned our bloodline. The quiet, productive hum of the office was suddenly interrupted by the sharp ringing of my desk phone. The private line was reserved strictly for high-level clients and my personal attorney. I leaned forward and glanced at the caller ID display. The name flashing across the digital screen made the breath catch in my throat. Caroline Davis. She had somehow tracked down my unlisted office number. For a fleeting second, a phantom echo of the old childhood anxiety flared in my chest. I imagined the frantic, manipulative voice waiting on the other end of the line. She would try to weaponize maternal guilt. She would talk about family loyalty, about shared blood, about the freezing conditions of her new suburban apartment. She would beg for a loan or a job, or simply the validation of my attention. She needed a lifeline to pull herself out of the wreckage she had created. Years ago, I would have answered that call. I would have engaged in the screaming match, desperate to make her understand the depth of the pain she had inflicted on me. I would have craved the apology she was fundamentally incapable of giving. I stared at the blinking name on the screen. The urge to answer, to gloat, to listen to her beg flickered through my mind. It would be a very easy, vindictive victory. But true power is not found in the final argument. True power is recognizing that the argument no longer matters. A calm, unshakable peace settled over my shoulders. I reached out my hand perfectly steady. I did not pick up the receiver. Instead, I pressed the button labeled Block Call. The flashing name vanished instantly, plunging the office back into a serene, productive silence. The connection was permanently severed. They had no access to my energy, my time, or my life ever again. I stood up from my desk and walked across the polished floor toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. I pushed open the heavy glass balcony door and stepped out into the crisp, high-altitude air. The sprawling grid of Chicago stretched out beneath me, a vast network of steel glass and relentless ambition. The wind whipped through my hair, carrying the scent of the lake and the electric hum of the city in motion. I rested my hands on the cold metal railing, looking down at the streets where I had once run for my life, carrying a stolen ledger in a duffel bag. The war was a distant memory. Sometimes the greatest forgiveness you can give a toxic family is letting them pay the price for their own greed. You do not have to save them from the consequences of their actions. You do not owe them your sanity, your capital, or your future. Success is not a weapon forged for revenge. Success is simply the quiet, unyielding reality you build when you finally cut the dead weight loose. Success is the moment you realize you never have to look back. I took a deep breath of the free city air turned away from the skyline and walked back into my office to get to work. I closed the heavy glass door of my balcony, leaving the roar of the Chicago wind outside. The chapter of the Davis family is officially sealed, not by a judge's gavel, but by my conscious choice to move forward. Staring at the quiet order of my office, I realized that surviving a predatory family requires more than just endurance. It demands a brutal, necessary rewiring of how you perceive duty, wealth, and power. If stepping through this fire has taught me anything, it boils down to 3 undeniable truths. First, DNA is a biological reality, not a lifetime contract. Society conditions us to believe that family is an unbreakable bond, demanding infinite chances and unconditional surrender. But when the people who share your blood view you merely as a shield for their liabilities or a scapegoat for their failures, the contract is void. Loyalty must be earned through respect and consistency. It can never be extorted through guilt. Walking away from toxic relatives does not make you a traitor. It makes you a survivor. Second, unchecked greed is a self-executing trap. Caroline, Richard, and Jamal spent decades wielding their wealth as a weapon to subjugate everyone around them. They believed their bank accounts made them invincible. However, the arrogance required to hollow out your own foundation blinds you to the structural damage. They did not need me to push them off the ledge. They built the cliff, stepped over the edge, and simply demanded I sacrifice myself to catch them. Letting gravity do its work was not an act of cruelty. It was the natural, inevitable consequence of their own hubris. Finally, the ultimate manifestation of power is silence. For years, a small part of me craved a genuine apology. I wanted them to acknowledge the pain of casting a young girl out into the freezing winter, but seeking closure from the people who broke you only keeps you tethered to their control. Pressing the block button on my mother's phone call was my definitive victory. True success does not require a screaming match or a public victory lap. It is reaching a point where the existence of your abusers no longer warrants a single second of your attention. I am Harper Davis. My ledger is balanced, and my future belongs entirely to me. If my journey resonated with you, if you have ever had to sever toxic ties to protect your own sanity and rebuild your life from scratch, drop a comment below. Share your experiences because speaking the truth strips these abusers of their power. Protect your peace, enforce your boundaries relentlessly, and never let anyone guilt you into paying the debts they created. Thank you for listening. Please hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications for Hazel Tells Stories so you never miss another journey of resilience and undeniable justice. Take care of yourselves and never look back.